The common saying that money makes the world go around is not far from the truth. Mankind is the only species which pays money to survive on this planet. We must pay rent for the land we live on, we must purchase the food we eat, we pay our bills and our taxes, all of which involve the exchange of money. Whilst we are told we live within a free society, without money one struggles to participate. Without money one is free to lose their home and live on the street. Without money one can starve to death. The world today is rich and bountiful, however the fruits of the Garden of Eden are only available to those with the currency to purchase them. As money became a central component of our society, so too has it permeated our culture. Our definition of success is interwoven with wealth. A big house, designer clothes and an expensive car are the aspirations of billions, while celebrity and fame is rarely granted to those in poverty. Idolization of the rich and their lifestyles runs rampant across the public discourse. It is consumerism and the spending of money for material acquisition that is rapidly outpacing our pursuits for philosophy, religion, or spiritualism. As we witness the continual rise of mega millionaires and billionaires, income inequality globally has increased to obscene levels. The combined wealth of Bezos, Gates, and Buffett is more than the bottom 50% of all Americans combined. Meanwhile, down the pyramid, the middle class is being decimated. The underclass and the working poor are growing, trapped in low-wage, precarious employment, and stuck in an endless cycle of bills and debt repayments. There is little prospect of economic advancement. Across the Western world, vast numbers of families struggle under high debt repayments, many living paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, in the Third World, the situations are far more severe. Conditions in Third World factories and sweatshops can aptly be described as Dickensian slave labour. For Third World farmers, the concentrated ownership of land and the extremely low rates of pay contribute towards the entrenched systems of serfdom and aristocracy. In a world which possesses the capacity to produce more food than could ever be required, under the distribution mechanisms of currency, there are routinely famines and food crises across Africa, in countries crippled under the load of foreign debt repayment schedules. Despite this suffering, the transnational corporations continue to embrace a new age of imperialism, stretching their operations across the globe in search of markets where labour and materials are cheapest. And so our lives have been shaped without our knowledge. Born into a class system dominated by currency, our livelihoods are determined by our bank accounts. It is money that leads us, money that motivates us, and in the pursuit of money that our actions can often be justified. For such a powerful mechanism of our society, very few members of the population have taken the time to investigate the structures of the monetary system. Our normalcy bias leads us to accept that money is money, as that is the way things are, and few of us bother to question how it was that it became this way. However, more of us are waking up and inquiring into a system which impacts our lives so severely. There is one simple question we must all understand which cuts right to the heart of the monetary system. Who creates the money? Who is it that creates the money that we use every day, and where does it come from? The answer to this question is not taught in the schools, nor is it commonly broadcast on television. Meanwhile, the banks and the financial regulators continue using sophisticated words and abstract, irrelevant economic theories in order to distract the population from discovering their dark secret. The truth is that we have been scammed. We have been tricked and lied to. More importantly, we have been robbed. And will continue to have our intergenerational wealth stolen from us until we collectively awaken from our ignorance and realise the existence of an economic system that has predestined us to serfdom. There is a dark secret behind the system of currency we possess today. Without our knowledge, we have been shackled into a financial machine, which parasitically feeds off of our society. It was designed and is run by a collective gang of usurers, bankers and slavers, with the grand intention of denigrating the human population into slavery. So I ask you again to think, where does money come from, and who created this money? To begin to answer these questions, we must look back in history at the origins of currency. Prior to the existence of money, there was barter. People traded goods with one another for the products that they couldn't produce themselves. A villager would trade 2 cabbages for 1 loaf of bread, or 8 chickens would be exchanged for 1 goat. This system worked well for small exchanges, however barter became difficult for items of higher value such as cows or land, and also in situations when no one was interested in the goods on offer. To solve this problem, over time units of transaction were developed. These were items which the society perceived as valuable and could be easily traded. Many different items of value were utilised as trading units throughout history. Seashells, cocoa beans, blocks of tea, tobacco, brass tokens, even bottles of whiskey in Sydney's early history all served as trading units. The items that were available for purchase would then be valued under the metric of these new trading units. One chicken would equal 3 blocks of tea, or a bag of potatoes would be worth 5 brass tokens. These new trading units served as a middleman between barter participants. Currency was born. Eventually, gold and silver became preferred forms of currency due to their desirability and durability, plus they could be easily moulded into coins and bars. Now, what is important to understand about these early currencies is that they were all built upon the trust of the community. Often they had little intrinsic value in themselves, however their value was derived from the belief that these currencies could be exchanged for items of similar value at some point in the future. It is this faith that underpins all forms of currency. With the development of the idea of a common currency, paper currency soon followed. When it was dangerous to travel with large amounts of gold on one's person, the goldsmiths developed a profitable system of enabling people to store gold safely within their vaults. For a small fee, a person could deposit their gold within their vaults and in exchange would receive a receipt for their deposit. This receipt could be presented back to the goldsmith at any time, and the person could redeem their gold. Over time, these receipts upon stored gold came to serve the same transactional value as real gold, as they possessed the trust that they could be redeemed for gold at any time. Upon noticing large volumes of gold sitting idle within their vaults, and realizing that not everyone was redeeming their gold, the goldsmiths got wise and designed a financial fraud. They started printing more receipts than they had in actual gold to redeem them. As long as everyone didn't convert their receipts into physical metal, no one would notice the extra notes floating in the economy. This was extremely profitable for the goldsmiths, as each time they were printing receipts they were effectively creating money. Even though there was no gold backing these receipts, the new fraudulent notes they were printing were just as valuable as the legitimate notes, as they carried the same faith that they could be redeemed for gold at any time. If everyone attempted to withdraw their gold at the same time, the goldsmith's con would be uncovered. People would realise that they have lost their gold, the faith in the currency would evaporate, the bank would collapse, and often the goldsmith was hanged. This situation is known as a bank run, and is the kryptonite of any banking system. However, it was this fraudulent behaviour of creating more receipts than actual reserves, upon which the foundations of our modern-day banking system were established. Throughout history, most paper currencies have been based upon physical assets such as gold. However, today's modern currencies are different. Today we have debt-based fiat currencies. Fiat is a Latin word meaning let it be so. The currency is made official by government decree. All of these currencies have their value derived not from a commodity backing, but rather from the faith that these currencies can be exchanged for goods and services in their economies. These currencies are representations of wealth for their respective economies. They are claim checks upon real wealth. However, the notes themselves are merely just numbers. It is those who can print and create these numbers who serve as the controllers of our monetary system. And with this, we return to our fundamental question: who creates the money? The simple answer is the banks. Yes, it is the private banking system, those who appear to generate vast fortunes through the management of our own wealth, that actually serve as the creators of the vast amounts of currency that we use today. Unbeknownst to many, banks actually possess the magical powers of credit creation. This may come as a surprise to many viewers, but one of the central purposes of this film is to educate the public that private banks create credit. When banks grant loans, they are actually generating new currency. Let's examine the process in detail. Here we have a typical Australian couple. Jack and Jill wish to purchase a house that costs $1 million. To do so, they approach the bank and ask for a loan. The bank tells them that they require a 10% deposit before the bank can extend them any money, so Jack and Jill work hard and save $100,000 cash as a deposit. They then return to the bank and request a loan for the remaining $900,000. The bank sees that they have good jobs, with stable incomes and a high probability of repaying the money, so the bank approves them for a loan. This is where the magic of banking begins. Most people have a false conception on how banks work. Many people believe that the banks operate by gathering large pools of savings from high numbers of depositors, and then lending these collected sums of money to borrowers at a higher interest rate. They believe this is where banks generate their profits. This is incorrect. This simplistic understanding fails to recognize that the fundamental power of the banking system is that private banks have the capacity to create bank credit. This idea is important to understand. Private banks create bank credit. When the bank extends a loan of $900,000, firstly they must comply with what's called a fractional reserve lending ratio. If they are required to observe a 10% reserve ratio, this means that to lend $900,000 they must first gather 10% of the loan, or $90,000 in the form of hard currency. Then for the remaining 90% of the loan, the bank is able to create $810,000 worth of bank credit and magically deposit this money into the borrower's account. It appears in the borrower's account as simply $900,000. This is because for all practical purposes, currency and bank credit are essentially the same. The only difference is their origin. Let's imagine that Jack and Jill lived in a hypothetical world where if we gathered every dollar in existence it would equal $1 trillion. There is exactly $1 trillion total in the economy. After Jack and Jill receive their new mortgage, the total amount of currency in the economy would be equal to $1 trillion plus $810,000. This is because when banks extend loans, they are creating bank credit, and in turn they are increasing the currency supply. It is interesting to note that this $810,000 of newly created bank credit, when it is redeposited in a bank, it itself can serve as the reserve for yet more loans. This is the cycle of credit creation. The banks incestuously lend credit to each other, forming the basis of their deposits and granting the equity for more loans. The system is based upon borrowing and lending. Today, the majority of money in the world does not exist in the form of physical notes and coins. Only a small fraction of the total currency supply exists in a physical form. The large majority of currency exists in the form of credits and numbers within bank accounts and balance sheets of the banking institutions. Currency is primarily a number representing purchasing power. It is the banks who provide us with this purchasing power through advances, loans, and overdrafts. It is the private banks who have gained control over the issuing of this purchasing power that have become the ruling authorities of our society. Now, it is important to note that when the banks lend currency, they always require it to be paid back with interest. This means that the amount that must be paid back is always equal to more than the amount that was borrowed. Imagine a hypothetical economy where zero currency exists. Disregarding a reserve ratio, imagine a bank creates a loan for $10,000 and requires that the borrower pay it back at a high interest rate. Well, if the newly created $10,000 is the only currency available, where does the borrower find the extra money to pay the interest on the original loan? The answer is through another loan. A new loan is required to generate enough currency to pay the interest on the original loan. The problem then arises that this new loan has interest payments due as well. Thus, another loan is required to repay the second loan, and so on and so on. A debt cycle has been created. There will always be more debt and interest owed than available currency in existence to repay these debts. It is a mathematical reality that in order for the system to continue operating, more and more borrowers must undertake new loans to support the interest payments on the loans that came before them. This is the system that has enslaved our modern economy. We have a debt-based monetary system that will always require continuous borrowing to keep it functioning. All currency existence exists as a form of debt to someone. As a society, it is a debt that can never be fully repaid. It can only grow. The debt-based currency system is the largest Ponzi scheme on the planet. When new borrowers cannot be found, the game of musical chairs comes to a halt, the debts become insolvent, and the system collapses. There will always be those who miss their repayments, default on their loans, and have their assets foreclosed upon, mainly because there will always be more debt in an economy than available currency to pay those debts. When borrowers apply for loans, they are required to put up collateral in lieu of a default. When a borrower does default, the bank seize this collateral. It is through such a system that the bankers have become the owners of the planet. By controlling the currency, the mechanism through which all life and objects are valued, the bankers have purchased the earth. It is those who hold the monopoly on the creation and distribution of credit that have become the hidden rule and powers of our society. Former director of the Bank of England, Sir Josiah Stamp, said this of banking. Banking was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Now, the levels in the creation of currency predictably flow in cycles. When economic conditions are good, the banks lend more money. When it is bad, they restrict the currency supply. These credit cycles are responsible for the economic booms and busts experienced by society. It is not economic miracles, but rather the expansion and contraction of the currency supply at the behest of the bankers. The philosophical question remains, why is it that these private institutions can create money, yet we have to work for it? If they can do it, why can't we? Or more importantly, why can't the government create its own money? Why is it that the government must grovel to a group of private corporations when theoretically the government could create as much interest-free money as it wanted itself? These are the fundamental questions exposing the insanity of our current monetary system. It was for this reason that Thomas Jefferson said, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power of currency shall be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs. Behind the private banks within each country sits a larger financial institution of incredible power. It is the central banks, often privately owned and independent of any government interference, that are the real monetary authorities of their respective economies. Whilst controlling monetary policy, they also possess the magical powers of credit creation. Today in the digital world, it only requires a click of a computer key for a central bank to generate as much currency as they require. One look at the expansion of central bank balance sheets over the past decade reveals how extensively the banks have utilised this power. This chart shows an expansion of over $15 trillion in just a decade. That is real-world wealth now owned by the central banks. It is the Reserve Bank of Australia, led by Governor Philip Lowe, that is the leading monetary authority in Australia today. However, the Reserve Bank was not always the economic powerhouse of monetary supremacy that exists today. Indeed, there was a long period of Australian history where Australia operated without a central bank. So how was it that we came to exist in this present situation? How were these structures of financial authority and credit creation established? And how did the RBA become responsible for Australia's monetary policy? In short, this film is a history of Australia's monetary system. Not only is it the story of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, but also of Australia's struggle for sovereignty against the cabals of international finance. It is by understanding our past that we can prepare ourselves for the future. The history of modern Australia begins with the arrival of the First Fleet. However, the struggle against the tyranny of finance stretches far back through history. For centuries prior, the role of finance had dominated life and politics. Financial dynasties such as the Medicis of Venice and secret orders such as the Knights Templar had long dominated the world of finance and banking prior to the Reformation. It was escape from the tyrannical overreach of the British Empire and the financial control of the City of London that had motivated many of the American colonists. With the printing of domestic currency such as the Massachusetts dollar, the battle against British monetary subservience began, and the sparks for the American Revolutionary War were lit. Even the Napoleonic Wars are at the whims of the money power, with the Rothschild banking houses of Europe funding both sides of the war. With the arrival of Captain Cook and the establishment of the first colony in Botany Bay in 1788, modern Australia was born. Pound sterling and British currency was brought over from England, but often due to shortages quickly proved inadequate in meeting the needs of the growing colony. Much of the currency that arrived in the colony would quickly leave again aboard the ships of the travelling merchants. Currency shortages were endemic. In response to these currency shortages, new methods of currency and exchange were developed. Barter was the primary method of exchange in the early days of the colony. The most popular item for trade became rum, through which wages and payments were transacted by the gallon. The holy dollar was established as a method of keeping the currency within the colonies. With the shipment of 10,000 pounds of Spanish silver dollars imported, the hole in the centre was punched out, creating two separate coins, the dump and the ring, which became known as the holy dollar. This unique currency served as a medium of exchange and was worthless outside of the colonies. In 1810, Governor Lachlan Macquarie sought permission from England to establish a government bank. His request was denied, and as such the alternative route was taken to foster the growth of a privately owned bank. By 1817, the Bank of New South Wales was open for business. As the colonies grew, more and more private banking institutions began to develop throughout Australia. Many of these Australian banks were simply Australian branches of the British-owned banking houses. These banks quickly began offering a wide range of services, including savings accounts, mortgages, overdrafts, and discounting bills of exchange. At the time, most of these banks were issuing their own private currencies, which they circulated in their respective communities. They paid a 2% tax on all bills to the state government for the privilege. The currencies themselves were supposedly based upon a gold standard, with each paper certificate entitling the holder to exchange the note and redeem the equivalent amount in gold coin. However, due to the nature of fractional reserve lending, most of these banking institutions had far more in credit and notes lent into their communities than actual gold to back these receipts. The state governments would audit these banks periodically, inspecting the solvency of the banks and checking gold reserves. Often the private banks would cooperate together, transporting one stockpile of physical gold from one bank to another, racing the gold across the countryside in an effort to fool the inspectors. Bushrangers were a common threat for those transporting gold throughout the countryside at the time. But even with these inconveniences and the more than occasional bank failures, the private banking houses were generating vast fortunes through their ability to create credit from nothing and charge interest to borrowers. With more and more arrivals, the Australian colonies were developing rapidly. Australia for the early years was primarily an agricultural export economy, producing agricultural products to be transported for sale back in London. The responsibility of the allocation of land had always come under the jurisdiction of the new colonial governments. The granting of huge tracts of land to individuals well connected within the upper echelons of British high society had become common practice, primarily with the intention of developing the feudal-based social structure comprised of a wealthy landowning aristocracy that had been so successful over in England. However, as more and more convicts gained their freedom and new colonists arrived in Australia, in an attempt to populate the largely barren countryside, the land was commodified, and Australian land could be purchased for a fee. The government began distributing the land and granted blocks for agricultural development. Often conditions included acres which were far into the outback, with settlers having to clear the land themselves by hand. The new squatters often went to war with the indigenous inhabitants to secure their holdings. As the land grab expanded, rapidly these frontier wars evolved into full-blown genocide. Gold rushes and mining became a significant feature of the Australian economy. As wealth and riches could be found across the country, many Australian workers, now termed diggers, made their way to the goldfields in the hopes of making it rich. These gold rushes would continue to assist converting many of Australia's convict colonies into progressive cities, plus also providing the private banking houses more gold reserves to extend further credit. As the private ownership of land steadily increased, the price and value of Australian land would become a defining part of Australian financial history. In the 1830s, a pastoral boom developed with the introduction of sheep-based collateral. Farmers would be able to receive credit from the banks by using their flocks of sheep as security for the loan. With credit easier to obtain than ever before, large inflows of currency rapidly raised the prices of pastoral land, sheep and wool. However, oversupply would eventually collapse the markets and prices would rapidly contract. Booms and busts such as these continued throughout the 19th century, as the banks rapidly expanded credit into segments of society, only to rapidly restrict the same credit when a crisis appeared. Of course, those who rode the booms acquired sizable fortunes and estates, whilst during the crashes the banking houses always foreclosed upon their pound of flesh. The most prominent of these booms and busts was the Australian financial crisis of the 1890s. With vast amounts of bank credit available to pastoralists in the pastoral boom of the 1880s, many farmers had gone deep into debt to finance construction and development of their properties. The banking houses were more than willing to extend this credit. However, when the price of wool collapsed, the rapid insolvency of many of these borrowers triggered a banking catastrophe. By the early 1890s, Australia was in the midst of a complete financial meltdown. In 1893, a chain reaction of insolvencies and bank collapses led to the worst banking crisis in Australian history. Of the 64 institutions that called themselves banks, only 10 of these were not forced to close their doors. In the weeks of April to May, at least half of all bank accounts in the country had been frozen, and at least half the note circulation ceased to be freely negotiable. Many of the Australians who had had their life savings deposited within these failed institutions lost everything. It was within this environment of economic disaster that the push developed for more and more government involvement in the banking sector. Most prominent amongst these ideas was the establishment of a state bank. By the mid-1890s, state banking was on the parliamentary agenda of 4 colonies. In New South Wales and Victoria, a royal commission and a select committee had both supported the idea of a state bank. In 1889, the government of South Australia held a royal commission into whether a state bank would work. However, the commission reported against it. However, banking policy often took a backbench at the time to the more pressing development of federation between the states and the establishment of the federal Commonwealth. The founders of the Australian Constitution empowered the Commonwealth Parliament with the powers to make laws regarding banking, other than state banking, the incorporation of banks, and the issue of paper money. It is with this inclusion that our story towards the Commonwealth Bank begins. At this point, it is necessary that we must acknowledge the flaws within the original Australian Constitution, with key figures such as Dunmore Lang fighting for the merits of Australian republicanism and the establishment of an independent sovereign nation. The resulting constitution was far from their ideal. When designing the Australian Constitution, to ensure it wasn't too close with the constitutional principles of America, the British Colonial Office secretly rewrote it and then instructed George Reid, Parkes's replacement as Premier of New South Wales, to submit their changes in his own name. Thus, instead of becoming a republic in 1901, an Act of British Parliament constituted Australia as a federation under the Crown. Rather than becoming a sovereign nation, Australia and the state governments became vassals, under the ultimate authority of British governors. The King of England would have the final say over all Australian government matters, with the ability to dismiss the elected governments at his discretion. This political structure would play a pivotal role in the decades to come. It is important to understand that the economic and political turmoil of the decades prior was essential in developing the intellectual and political will for the future establishment of the Commonwealth Bank, the idea for which would emerge from within the Australian Labor Party. Ever since the establishment of the labour movement, the party representing the working man had always been adversarial to the owners of capital. Over time, the monetary system came to represent the mechanism through which labour was exploited. The controllers of the monetary system were collectively characterised as the money power, and it was against this enemy which labour leaders directed their opposition. Throughout the 1890s, the spirit to do battle against the money power grew significantly within the Labour Party, becoming a defining characteristic of the old labour movement. At the same time over in America, a similar dissatisfaction with finance had been emerging. In the American election of 1896, Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan had made currency reform the central issue of his campaign. Meanwhile, the system of Hamiltonian economics, based upon the philosophy of Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, had been utilising the power of a national banking system to finance development across the country. The success of this system served as an example for the possibilities for Australian reform. The American influence was so strong at the time that the Australian Party decided to adopt the American spelling of Labour for its party name, which is why Labour is spelt without the U. Back home, currency reform continued to be debated, and by 1902, a federal ALP conference had approved the idea of founding a Commonwealth Bank. Now, one cannot mention the early labour movement or the founding of the Commonwealth Bank without acknowledging one of its most tireless campaigners, the Honourable King O'Malley. Born in North America near the Washington-Canadian border, he arrived in Australia in the 1880s and entered politics through the South Australian House of Assembly in 1896. He joined the Commonwealth government by entering the first ever federal parliament as a representative for Tasmania. O'Malley had been strongly influenced by the success of the American system of economics, aiming to replicate Hamilton's success domestically. To quote O'Malley himself, "I am the Hamilton of Australia." The momentum for state banking had been developing for some time within the Labour Party. However, it was with O'Malley's efforts that the issue was forced into the forefront of party policy. To do this, O'Malley formed a faction of Labour MPs later to be known as the Torpedo Brigade. Comprised of 19 members of the Labour caucus, it contained some of the most impassioned monetary reformists in Australian history. It was in July 1908, at the Federal Labour Conference in Brisbane, that King O'Malley presents the largest banking proposal for the establishment of a Commonwealth Bank. With his Torpedo Brigade in attendance, they secure the votes required and his proposals are adopted. The proposal for the Commonwealth Bank had become Labour policy, with Plank 6 of its fighting platform promising the establishment of a Commonwealth Bank of issue, deposit, exchange and reserve for the purpose of carrying out with facility and economy the financial transactions of the Commonwealth and state governments. There is no doubt that O'Malley had extensive knowledge of the inner workings of the banking system. In 1909, O'Malley gave a 5-hour speech to the House of Representatives on the merits of national banking and the need for currency reform. The time for change had arrived. The federal election of 1910 was primarily between Labour and a coalition of 3 non-Labour parties. The result was a landslide victory for the Labour Party. It was the first time in Australian history that a single party had won a majority of seats in both houses of Parliament. The new government was to be led by Andrew Fisher. With a Labour government in power, filled with impassioned and dedicated monetary reformists, the time for banking reform against the money power had begun. With a majority in Parliament, they were able to actively achieve nearly the entirety of their platform. Fisher's second Labour government was only in power for 3 years, from April 1910 to April 1913. However, the legacy from its brief time the party was in power would affect the direction of Australian finance for years to come. The first economic reform undertaken is the establishment of the note issue. The Australian Notes Act is introduced on the 26th of July 1910 and is quickly assented to on the 16th of September. This bill granted the Treasury the power to issue its own currency, and the Australian pound was born. Previously, private banks had printed their own private notes to serve as currency. This bill did not outlaw these private currencies by consolidating the note issue within the Treasury. However, later these private banknotes were taxed at a rate of 10%, making the new government notes the preferred tender. It was 1 year later that the most significant bill of the Fisher Labour government would be presented. On November 1st, 1911, Andrew Fisher's Labour government introduced the Commonwealth Bank Act, the bill which would establish the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The bill called for the development of a government-owned trading bank. This bank would be an independent institution, although it would still answer to Parliament, to which it would present twice-yearly audits conducted by the Auditor-General. The bank was to be ruled by a single man, appointed as governor who oversaw the operations of the bank. The bill would also establish the Savings Bank Division, enabling the bank to open savings accounts and receive deposits. It would be permitted to issue debentures out of which it could raise its initial capital. The security of these bonds would be the national credit. Now, the bank proposed within the bill was not the grand central bank of monetary policy envisioned by O'Malley, nor was it a bank capable of puncturing the monopolies of finance pressured by others within the Labour Party. It had only a few of the features of Hamiltonian credit creation and control over monetary policy, which O'Malley had originally fought for. Instead, the proposal was for the establishment of an ordinary private bank, with the advantage being that the bank would be publicly owned and would be able to carry out the financial transactions of the government. When the bill was presented, a leading member of the opposition, W.H. Irving, said of the bill, "This is O'Malley pasteurised." The debate over the bill was fierce. The primary concern of critics was placing so much power in the hands of a single man. Why should the government-owned bank be operated by a single governor with autocratic control? The Bank of England, the Bank of France, the Deutsche Bank were all governed by bank boards. Why should Australia depart from this international standard of banking governance? However, Fisher stood by the original drafting of the bill. Plus, there was the safeguard that the governor could be removed by Act of Parliament in exceptional circumstances. The second critique came from a strong concern over states' rights and their financial ability to compete with the bank. With the establishment of a Commonwealth Savings Bank, many of the state-run savings banks would be placed in direct competition for deposits accounts with the new national bank. Outside of Parliament, the bill was severely polarised. With the bill being strongly opposed by the anti-Labour forces, the bankers' propaganda machine was put to work. The newspapers were in uproar that if the private banks lost their monopoly on the control over the currency, the country would go to the dogs. Papers ran the headlines, Fisher's flimsies, puppet governor, tied to caucus, cheap money for speculators. The Melbourne Argus bluntly stated, "The whole scheme is conceived in idiocy. It constitutes a malicious use of public funds to compete with private activities which enjoy the full confidence of the public." There is not the slightest justification for it, and its failure from its inception is so much a matter of certainty that the whole proposition will be abandoned after a few months of inglorious experiment. However, against the hail of negative propaganda, the messages of financial reform and the benefits of a Commonwealth Bank were still reaching the people. A leading article from The Worker on the 30th of November 1911 spoke of Labour's financial reform. But there was still one sphere of activity left to John Fatt Esquire, one hallowed domain within which no Labour man he thought would dare plant his plebeian boots. Finance, the banking business, the manipulation of currency, the profound yet delicate operations of the money market. With these, said John Fatt unctuously, the Labour Party will never presume to meddle. What a shock has his complacency received. Even with fierce opposition, due to the Labour Party having a majority in both houses of Parliament, the bill was passed practically without amendment. With the bill passed, it received its assentment from the Governor-General and became law on the 22nd of December 1911. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia was born. With the bill assented, Fisher immediately went about the task of selecting the man who was to run this new government institution. The man he picked for the job was an experienced senior banker from the Bank of New South Wales, called Samuel Denison Miller. Originally named Samuel Denison King, he was the son of a schoolmaster born on the 8th of March 1860 in a hamlet near Wollongong. He began a career in banking at the age of 16, when he was appointed a probationer in the Bank of New South Wales at Deniliquin. 6 years later, he was transferred to the head office in Sydney as a clerk. He remained there until promoted to accountant in 1895, General Manager's assistant 5 years later, General Manager's inspector in 1907, and inspector of the metropolitan branches by 1909. It was on May 14, 1912, that Prime Minister Fisher formally offered him the position of governor. When approached by Fisher, Miller had just returned from a world tour on which he had studied the banking practices of other countries. Within a fortnight of being contacted by Prime Minister Fisher, Miller had accepted the position. He was to have a salary of £4,000 a year, plus generous travel expenses, with his appointment secured for a duration of 7 years. And so it was, on June 1st, 1912, that Denison Miller assumed the office of Governor of the Commonwealth Bank. And immediately Miller begins the mammoth task of building the new bank, which was to be owned by the Commonwealth of Australia. To begin this process, it was expected that the bank would require starting capital. The power of the Commonwealth Bank Act enabled the governor to issue debentures to finance the initial capital required to start the bank, debentures being a mechanism for raising loans, with the loans collateralised by the assets of the company. However, in Miller's mind, if he was forced to service the interest payments on initial capital debentures, then rather than serving the Australian people, the bank would effectively be denigrated to the status of a machine generating profits in the interest of bondholders. Instead, Miller utilised the credit of the Australian people, stating proudly, "This bank is being started without capital, as none is required at the present time, but it is backed by the entire wealth and credit of the whole of the Commonwealth of Australia." With this spirit, Denison Miller firstly directs his attention towards establishing the Savings Banks Department. Using the ready-made infrastructure present within the post office system, he sets up deposit-taking facilities across Australia. Many of the state banks which were previously using these post offices were forced to vacate in place for the Commonwealth. By the 15th of July 1912, the Victorian branch office had been established in Melbourne, and 489 agencies were present in post offices throughout the state. The very first depositors in the Melbourne branch were the Prime Minister, the Chairman of the Associated Banks, and King O'Malley. In 1912, in an official opening ceremony of the Commonwealth Bank, future Prime Minister William Hughes said, "The bank stands here today as the outward and visible sign of the wealth and substance of the whole people. It is indeed Australia commercially translated in the terms of money. It is the symbol of our wealth. It will stand as long as we stand. Of its solvency there can be no doubt while the race that made Australia stands." The Commonwealth Bank expanded rapidly. By the 16th of September 1912, Queensland had deposit-taking facilities within 194 post offices. A few days later, the Northern Territory had agencies in Darwin and a few remote outback posts. By the 1st of January 1913, Tasmania had opened for business with facilities within 147 post offices. And 12 days later, New South Wales, South Australia and Western Australia all had facilities open for savings bank business. Curiously, the interest rates that the bank were offering on deposits for its savings banks department was far from aggressive, being less than those offered by the private banks. The rate on deposits was fixed at 3%, with a limit on interest paid up to £300, whilst the private banks were offering higher rates with larger maximums. However, the competition of the new Commonwealth Savings Bank had already forced the private institutions to effectively abolish their charges on current accounts and keep fees on loans and overdrafts within reasonable limits. It was in May 1913 that construction on the new head office in Sydney's Martin Place began. Huge blocks of sandstone were mined at the quarries of nearby Woollahra. In honour of the start of construction, Governor Denison Miller sets one of the stones at the entrance of the bank. When construction was completed, it would be from this building that the operations of the Commonwealth Bank would be conducted. By August 1913, the Savings Bank Department had grown to over 90,000 accounts with a balance of £2.8 million. But Denison Miller could not focus completely on the Savings Bank Department. He also needed to establish the General Banking Division. His main priority was the hiring of senior officers of the bank. The two most important positions were to be the Deputy Governor and, due to the importance of British finance, the manager of the London branch of the Commonwealth Bank. As his Deputy Governor, he appointed a man named James Kell, who had been an inspector at the Bank of Australasia. He would have a salary of £1,500 per year. To serve as a London branch manager, he chose Charles Campion, a senior banker knowledgeable of British finance. Having served as the London manager of the Australian Bank of Commerce, he would have a salary of £2,000 per year. With these appointments, alongside a raft of newly appointed middle management and banking staff, the bank opens for general bank business on the 20th of January 1913. The opening of the bank was a monumental achievement. It was only 7.5 months prior that Miller had accepted his appointment as governor. However, by 1913, the bank had been well and truly established, and from humble beginnings, the institution was set to grow. Miller had ambitious plans to grow the bank. Rather than focusing heavily on the savings bank department, he in time believed that the bank would play a more increasing role as the government banker, including the state governments. He hoped that in time his bank would become a medium for the consolidation of state debts, and with legislation take over the note issue. He aimed for the Commonwealth Bank to become the primary bank of the federal government. In the 1913 general election, Andrew Fisher's Labor government is replaced by the Liberals. However, as the governor was appointed for a period of 7 years and faced no direct ministerial interference, it had little impact on the bank. In 1914, Labor had returned to power. By its second year of operations, the bank had grown significantly. From 1913 to 1914, savings bank agencies had increased from 153 to a total of 2,048, with deposit accounts rising from 83,558 to 143,143. Assets and liabilities also rose from £5.1 million in June 1913 to £9.8 million by June 1914. The bank was growing rapidly. With the outbreak of the First World War, the domestic and international economic conditions changed rapidly, and within this new environment, the Commonwealth Bank took up a new position of financial importance. The three main financial problems faced by the Australian government at the time were first, how to raise the necessary funds to pay for the country's part in the war, second, how to maintain civil production in competition with war needs, and third, how to finance international trade under wartime conditions. In response to these, the Treasury immediately sets about expanding the note issue. The Commonwealth Bank began acting as an agent on the note issue for the Treasury through the delivery and exchange of old bills. The note issue itself was updated against the gold standard. Private banks received £3 worth of notes for every £1 of gold deposited within the Treasury. With £300 of notes, the banks could extend up to £3,000 of bank credit. This was exceedingly profitable for the private banks and led to vastly increased credit lending. New £1,000 notes were printed exclusively to be held by the banks in their vaults for the purposes of extending more credit. As credit lending expanded so rapidly, the gold convertibility of these Australian notes was effectively suspended without a formal public acknowledgement. By July 1915, no gold could be exported without Treasury approval, and by July 1916, all gold export except that by the government was prohibited. The effect of these policies led to the skyrocketing of the note issue. Within 1 year, the note issue had increased from £9.6 million in June 1914 to £32.1 million by June 1915. This eventually reached a peak of £59.7 million by October 1918. With such an expansion of the physical note issue, the private banks further extended credit, profitable for themselves whilst granting the public large amounts of purchasing power. In a move to secure public confidence in the banking sector, the Commonwealth Bank announced that it would stand behind the private banks, guaranteeing deposit accounts for any bank that faced liquidity crises due to withdrawals. The Commonwealth Bank had mitigated any risk of bank runs and prevented a financial collapse, whilst across Europe, many banking institutions were in freefall. With the war raging, primary producers too were facing considerable challenges. British demand for Australian exports had been largely affected due to financial shocks from the war. The shortages of ships used to transport agricultural products and the dangers of international shipping also posed significant difficulties. With large harvests expected and little demand to purchase them, many industries were facing catastrophic price collapses. With strong cooperation between the federal government and the Commonwealth Bank, the solution to this threat was proposed through the establishment of agricultural pools. Into these pools, farmers would sell their products at guaranteed prices, and the pool administrators in turn would organise the sale and transport of these goods to London. These pools would serve as collection points, gathering entire harvests and releasing supply slowly when sufficient demand became available. In an environment where supply had completely overshot available demand, the guaranteed pricing mechanisms of these pools saved many of Australia's farmers and primary producers from economic ruin and prevented the collapse of agricultural prices. The Commonwealth Bank was the institution which provided the credit directly used by the Commonwealth Government to finance these pools. Wheat was the first agricultural product to be serviced by a pool. Huge stockpiles of grain made their way across the countryside and were stored in large warehouses to be released slowly when economic conditions enabled. When ocean freight became available, the harvest was rapidly transported to London. Wool too was a primary beneficiary of the pooling mechanism. Demand for wool had collapsed in England due to many British wool manufacturers unable to obtain credit. The Commonwealth Bank provided the credit for wool purchases to British manufacturers through its London branch and enabling the sale of Australian wool. Great warehouses of wool developed waiting to be shipped to London. Many more of Australia's agricultural products developed pools thanks to the finance from the Commonwealth Bank. Butter and cheese pools were financed, saving large segments of the dairy industry. Sugar pools were financed to support the cane growers. Huge warehouses of sugar developed awaiting shipment to London. Meat exports were financed through a pool. Abattoirs across the country were kept in business, and beef and mutton exports made their way to London. Rabbits too were a considerable export during the war, with the Commonwealth Bank financing a rabbit pool. Fruit and jams were also covered by an agricultural pool, with finance available for the purchase of surplus fruit production and exportable jams. By the end of the war, the agricultural pools were so successful they continued on for several years. Within not too long, the total amount paid to primary producers through the use of these agricultural pools had totalled £437,500,000. It can be said that nearly all of the agricultural production of the wartime period was financed and saved thanks to the Commonwealth Bank, and if it were not for the actions of the Commonwealth Bank, much of the Australian agricultural community would have been decimated. If the Commonwealth Bank had not acted, many of these farmers would have lost their land to the private banks through foreclosure. To support the considerable amount of export, the Commonwealth Bank, under the direction of Prime Minister William Morris Hughes, arranged for the purchase of a fleet of cargo ships to transport Australian shipping. In 1916, the Commonwealth Government purchased 15 ships for a total of £2,052,654, financed thanks to the Commonwealth Bank's London branch. These ships transported much of the primary produce financed by the pools back to London. But one of the primary functions of the bank during the First World War was the raising of the war loans to finance the Australian war effort. It was on the 1st of July 1915 that Fisher announced in Australian Parliament that Australia would float its own war loans to finance its wartime expenditure. The Commonwealth Bank was to be solely responsible for the flotation and management of the bonds. The first war loan raised was a remarkable success. With an initial target of £5 million at a return of 4.5%, the amount subscribed was for £13.4 million, with over 18,000 individual subscribers. What was more significant was the cost savings for the Commonwealth. Had the government sourced these loans from London, as was the standard experience, the flotation expenses of raising the loans were approximately 6%. However, by raising the loans domestically, the flotation expenses for the loans were a paltry 0.56%, a huge saving for the government. The Commonwealth Bank set about raising the war loans across Australia. Community quotas and other marketing material were used to sell war bonds. By the end of the war and the 3 years after, a total of 10 war loans had been raised, the last 3 being labelled peace loans used to finance the government's commitments to returning servicemen after the war. In total, over £250 million had been subscribed domestically, providing the Australian government with the purchasing power needed to finance massive wartime expenditures. The war was an extremely costly campaign. Not only did Australia pay for the costs of transporting its men halfway across the world to a foreign battlefield, there were also the significant operational costs of food, accommodation, equipment and ammunition. Even though Australia was fighting in service of the British Empire, for king and country, the colonies were expected to fund their own way, and the British government continued to send Australia the bills for its service. The Gallipoli campaign was comparatively inexpensive, costing £2.5 million. However, as the war continued on, it became significantly more expensive. For example, as the fighting continued in France, the fees for gun ammunition increased up to 9 shillings 7 pence per soldier per day. The first year of the war had cost Australia £47,500,000, by which time 146,700 troops had been deployed overseas. By October 1918, the monthly cost for Australia to fight the war had reached £7 million. By June 1922, the total cost of the war for Australia was calculated over £505 million. £370 million of this was raised from war loans, of which £270 million had been raised domestically thanks to the Commonwealth Bank. £135 million had been paid from annual taxation, with the remaining total being sourced from overseas loans. After much negotiation, by 1921 it had been determined that Australia owed England £92,697,681 for its wartime expenditure. England charged 5% interest on all balances outstanding. Now, one could easily question the need to use debt to finance a war. The substantial size of the wartime liabilities incurred would later become significant when sizable loan repayments would be crippling for the state economies. Prominent Labor MP Frank Anstey, a member of O'Malley's Torpedo Brigade, protested strongly against debt financing the war effort. This war will put a millstone of debt around the necks of the producing classes of every country. It will make the monetary power more powerful and opulent than ever. All who remain alive from the slaughter will toil to pay the parasitical classes annual tribute for money invested in blood. All wars, all international wars, are the instruments by which inequities re-establish their crumbling thrones, by dissipating on battlefields the human virility that threaten their existence. But the question remains, why should governments be forced to debt finance wartime activity when the government could theoretically produce all the credit it required? The government at the time had control over the note issue. If the will had existed, the Treasury could have financed its wartime expenditure through a direct expansion of the note issue. However, neither the know-how or the political will existed during the period, and Australia paid its bill by mortgaging its future prosperity. The government bank didn't provide debt-free financing for the war effort because the bank was not the economic powerhouse of credit creation that was originally envisioned by O'Malley. Rather, it was simply an ordinary bank, owned and operating in the interests of the Australian people. Despite these limitations, the bank had proved a valuable service to Australia during the war, and under the nationalistic direction of Sir Denison Miller, the bank would continue to finance the development of Australia. It was during the war that the new head office was constructed and finally opened in Sydney on the 22nd of August 1916. Throughout the war, the bank kept in close contact with the Commonwealth government and the heads of the private banking institutions, so Miller is shown here in this photo with some of the most powerful members of the Australian financial community. By the end of the war, the role of the bank had changed drastically. Although still small in comparison to the totality of the private trading banks, the Commonwealth Bank had become a powerful institution. Its strength had been largely developed thanks to its unique relationship it held with the Commonwealth government. After the war, the bank begins to direct its focus towards the post-war reconstruction of Australia. In 1919, the bank begins a program of financing homes for returning servicemen. In total, 8,017 applications for the scheme were approved, with the program purchasing 5,179 existing homes and constructing 1,777 new ones for servicemen. Here, Denison Miller is shown laying the foundation stone of the first war service home built under the scheme. It was schemes such as these which provided great benefit to the working people of Australia. It was in recognition of his service in assisting the Australian war effort that it was decided that Denison Miller would be knighted. Upon the announcement of his knighthood in the papers, the entire Commonwealth Bank staff had gathered at the ground floor of the building to offer Denison Miller their congratulations. Miller is shown here in this rare footage receiving congratulations from staff members of the bank. Miller would be bestowed this award by the Prince of Wales, who had travelled to Australia. In honour of the Prince's visit, the Governor-General hosts a grand banquet the night before the ceremony. And so it was on the 3rd of June 1920 that Sir Denison Miller was knighted and received the title of Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George for his services to Australia. By an Act of Parliament on December 14, 1920, the note issue was removed from the Treasury and placed within the newly created Note Issue Department at the Commonwealth Bank. It was here at the first meeting of the new Note Issue Board that the policy of the Note Board was formulated. One of the dreaded fears of this board was inflation, particularly due to the hyperinflationary episodes within post-war Europe, and as would later validate their concerns, the catastrophic experience of Weimar Germany. One of the most emphatic on the board for decreasing the quantity of the note issue was John J. Garvin. Garvin himself stated publicly, "We must strive to become a free gold country again, but until we get rid of our surplus paper money, this cannot happen." It was this perspective of contractionism which would have grave consequences for Australia in the decade to come. But besides this sentiment, the note issue declined only slightly. Within just 2.5 years, by the 30th of June 1923, the Notes Department alone had generated a profit of £3,097,000. It is often speculated for what reason did the government surrender control over the note issue. One theory proposes that it was Sir Miller's intention to strengthen the bank into the monetary authority of the economy. To do this, it would require control over the note issue. It was also the global standard practice in economies around the world that the note issue was separate from government control, Australia being a unique exception at the time. Regardless of the motives, the note issue was separated from the Treasury, a decision which would haunt future governments. The Commonwealth Bank continued with its post-war development of Australia. On the 7th of July 1921, Sir Miller told a crowd, "The whole of the resources of Australia are at the back of this bank, and so strong as this continent is, so strong is the Commonwealth Bank. Whatever the Australian people can intelligently conceive in their minds and will loyally support, that can be done." With this spirit of national development, it continued financing a range of public works and infrastructure projects for local governing bodies. It financed hydroelectric dams in Tasmania, generating vast amounts of electricity. It also secured the finance for the development of a municipal abattoir in Newcastle. By the end of June 1923, in total it had lent up to £3 million for the development of road construction, bridges and drainage, and a total of £9,360,000 for council development projects. Alongside these projects, the Commonwealth Bank continued to expand its branches and banking facilities across Australia. The bank was growing larger and would continue to service more and more of the Australian people. However, tragedy would strike the Commonwealth Bank and in turn the nation of Australia. On the 6th of June 1923, Sir Denison Miller died suddenly from heart failure. He was 63 years old. Sir Denison Miller was mourned like few others in Australian history. His funeral was highly attended, a testament to the benefit that his service had rendered to the Australian people. In his 11 years as governor, he had built the Commonwealth Bank from scratch into the prized institution of the Commonwealth. He was one of the few knighted men who was not changed to the subservience of the British Empire. Upon his death, the era of Sir Denison Miller's Commonwealth Bank had ended. Now, the Commonwealth Bank was not the perfect institution. It was not O'Malley's original vision of a financial weapon of the people, designed to puncture the money power. It had not challenged the private banks upon their systems of credit creation, nor had it forced the private banks out of business through fierce competition as was desired by many members of the Labour Party. But what it did become was a representation that the institution of finance could be used for the benefit of the Australian public. It had provided the finance for many of the programs which the private banking institutions would never have touched. It showed that the power of banking, if used with the intention of generating economic benefits for the people, rather than for shareholders, could do far more good than any government. However, often the interest of the people directly conflicted with the interests of private banking. It was because of this that the private banks began planning their next move. With the death of Governor Sir Denison Miller, Deputy Governor James Kell had taken over as the new governor of the Commonwealth Bank. However, his tenure was not to last long, as the agents of British finance had their own ideas for the future of the bank. With the chief adversary of the private banks eliminated, they could now begin proposing the reforms which would never have been possible while Sir Miller was still alive. The Bruce Page government had come to power on the 9th of February 1923. Nationals Party leader Stanley Bruce had formed a coalition with Country Party leader Earl Page, who would serve as his Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer. Having announced in his opening speech to Parliament that a key theme for his Prime Ministership would be men, money and markets, he was eager to implement significant financial reform. In October 1923, Prime Minister Bruce travels to England on a 4-month visit to attend the Imperial Conference. Whilst there, he has extensive meetings with Britain's financial elite, particularly Lord Glendyne of the House of Neverston, who had previously underwritten the Australian government loans in England. It was likely upon this trip to England that he had received the orders from British finance to radically alter the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Upon his return to Australia, he sets about the task of reining in Australia's government bank. It was in June 1924 that the Bruce Page government introduced legislation to amend the Commonwealth Bank Act. The legislation's primary motive was to prevent a nationalistically inclined governor from extending credit in the same method which Sir Miller had done. It was the Commonwealth Bank Act of 1924 that destroyed the original Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The primary effect of the bill was to reform the leadership structure of the bank. Rather than a single governor ruling with autocratic power, the seniority structure would be altered so that the bank would now be run by a board of directors. The directors on the board would appoint a chairman who would possess a casting vote over board decisions. The result would be that the authority of the bank would now vest in this new board of directors, many of whom were financial magnates representing their respective business communities. J.J. Garvin, the man who had adamantly pushed for the deflation of the note issue, would become the chairman of the first Commonwealth Bank Board. Control over the note issue would also be placed under the authority of this new board. The Commonwealth Bank would also be forced to publish the rates of interest it provided for discounting bills of exchange. This would enable the private banks huge amounts of arbitrage in pricing, profits gained directly at the expense of the Commonwealth Bank. The bill also permitted the private banks to settle their interbank balances with cheques drawn against the Commonwealth Bank. Without the need to settle their accounts with physical notes, the banks were allowed to keep their legal tender as the basis for more credit, a very profitable arrangement. Naturally, with such a powerful bill, the debate within Parliament was significant. The leader of the opposition, Labour Minister Mr Matthew Charlton, openly told the House that
the bill was nothing less than an attempt to kill the bank.
Mr Macon also declared his opposition.
The government undoubtedly desires to place the bank in subjection to private banking institutions and to prevent it from fulfilling the real purpose for which it was established. It is to be prevented by unsympathetic administration from functioning in the interests of the general community.
However, even with fierce debate, the bankers managed to get their way. By declaring the matter urgent, the bill quickly passed through both houses. On the 20th of August 1924, the bill was assented by the Governor-General, and on the 10th of October 1924, the Commonwealth Bank Act was proclaimed law. Immediately the reform begins, and after a quick and efficient restructuring of the leadership structure, the bank was now under the command of the Commonwealth Bank Board. The new board consisted of 8 men, the Governor, the Secretary of Treasury, and the rest were representatives of the different financial magnates and business houses. Many of these directors had direct interests in the private banks and financial institutions of which the Commonwealth Bank had been previously competing. The bank had been hijacked. With this new board in place, the private banks immediately begin their extortion of the Australian economy, starting with the decimation of the wool industry. The agricultural pools of Sir Dennis and Miller's Commonwealth Bank had been shut down, and the new bank board refused to finance primary industry. The private banks notified the Wool Council that they would refuse to finance the wool sales without huge amounts of collateral, which the farmers did not possess. Without the ability to obtain finance, the price of wool collapsed and many farmers faced total ruin. The banks foreclosed on many of the mortgaged properties. Within 1 year, the private banks had also significantly increased the cost of borrowing through fees and charges. Bank rates for primary producers rose to an equivalent of $14 million compared to the equivalent of only $6 million the season prior. Early in his prime ministership, Bruce had promised that Australian produce would take pride and place on the British dinner table. However, the financial conditions being dealt to primary producers by the private banking institutions had become intolerable for farmers. Conditions had deteriorated so severely and so rapidly that farmers across the country rose up in protest. In response to this rising anger, in 1925 the Commonwealth Bank Rural Credits Bill was brought forward as a solution. But like most financial reforms brought about by the Page government, this one too favoured the private banks. The bill created a separate department within the Commonwealth Bank called the Rural Credits Department. Publicly, the bill empowered the bank to issue debentures against machinery, land, building, coming crops and other forms of capital so that farmers would be able to receive credit from the Commonwealth Bank at a rate of around 4%. The bill was passed on the 14th of September 1925 to a hail of celebration from the banker-controlled media. However, behind the mirage, the bill only further assisted the private banks. A provision within the bill also authorised the Rural Credits Department to advance loans to private banks and financial institutions alongside farmers. In practice, when farmers approached the Commonwealth Bank with adequate capital, often they would be told that the bank did not engage in their type of business. Instead, they were directed to the private banks for finance at a much higher rate. Meanwhile, the private banks were having no trouble in receiving loans from the Rural Credits Department, credit which they took and immediately lent to farmers at higher rates. The bill was a scam for the benefit of the private banks, and the Commonwealth Bank fully supported it. Meanwhile, the Bank of England decided to send their comptroller, Sir Ernest Harvey, to Australia. He arrives in early 1927 with the purpose of advising the Commonwealth Bank on aspects of central banking. Central banking had been developing like a virus at this time. Countries around the world were witnessing the rise of central banking institutions operating independent of their governments, which would dictate the monetary policies of their respective economies. Sir Harvey desired to convert the Commonwealth Bank into Australia's central bank. On arrival, he had discovered that his task was already nearly accomplished. However, he was alarmed at the apparent strength of the bank. It still had a huge amount of capital stored in the form of savings bank deposits, and if Parliament ever legislated control of the bank out of the hands of the Bank Board, then the bank could easily be restored to its former position of a people's bank. British finance could not permit this. In late 1927, under Sir Harvey's direction, the Bruce Page government dutifully introduces the Commonwealth Bank Savings Bank Act. The bill separated the Savings Bank Department from the Commonwealth Bank, placing the division under 3 directors appointed by the Governor-General. In effect, it removed the bank's cash reserves, terminating the bank's trading operations, and decimated its capacity to create credit. The bill became law on the 22nd of December 1927, and the Savings Department was removed from the Commonwealth Bank. The bank had been strangled. The Great Australian Bank, which had once acted in the interest of the very people that owned it, and had provided so much benefit during the First World War, was no more. In its place was a corrupted hollow shell, weakened and chained to serve the interest of the private banks. However, there were still 2 important features that remained. One was that ownership of the bank still remained in the hands of the Australian people, and the second was that the bank still possessed the capacity to create credit. If the bank was able to escape the clutches of the Bank Board, the Commonwealth Bank could be restored. In recognition of his service towards the benefit of the British Empire, Prime Minister Bruce was later granted the title of Lord Bruce of Melbourne in 1947, and became the first Australian-born citizen to take a seat in the British House of Lords. In 1926, due to medical reasons, J.J. Garvin retires from the Commonwealth Bank. He is replaced by Sir Robert Gibson, who becomes the new chairman of the Commonwealth Bank Board. It was the policy of the previous Commonwealth Bank, under the governorship of Sir Denison Miller, that since the 1920s the bank had aimed to prevent deflation of the currency supply. This was in direct contradiction to the international example being set by other banks overseas. However, under the direction of the new Commonwealth Bank Board, the bank had decided to reverse this policy completely. With the separation of the Savings Bank Department achieved, the new board actively set out to promote deflation. Between December 1927 and June 1928, the directors of the Commonwealth Bank decided to sell to the Commonwealth Savings Bank $7.6 million worth of securities, whilst at the same time the bank called in $8 million worth of advances. As this currency was being used as the capital upon which further loans were extended, the result of these actions was the removal of the equivalent of approximately $84 million worth of currency from the general economy. With a huge portion of currency vanishing from the economy, business activity was decimated. Meanwhile, the private banks on their own initiative were following the international example and began implementing deflationary policies themselves, restricting new loans whilst calling in advances. They were consciously preparing themselves and the Australian economy for the recession that was to come. It was over in the United States that the nucleus of the coming global recession was being established. With the death of President William Harding in 1923, JP Morgan's puppet politician President Calvin Coolidge, alongside his Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, were actively preparing the country to be ravaged by the schemes of international finance. They deregulated the banks, enacted public austerity programs, and introduced the new form of margin loans, which later would become so dangerous. Margin loans enable borrowers to secure huge amounts of finance without collateral for the purposes of speculative investment in the stock market. The condition was that the banks could forcibly recall these loans at any time within 24 hours' notice, through the compulsory sale of stock. This was all by design. The margin loans proved extremely popular, and the Dow began to skyrocket. As stock prices rose, margin loans became even more popular, which led to even further price rises and a speculative frenzy erupted. The bubble had been created. The financial boom of the so-called Roaring Twenties was not the post-war economic miracle, but rather was built upon the rapid and uncollateralized expansion of margin loans and debt financing. When the time was right, the banks prepared to stop the music and bring the system crashing down. Of course, before they pulled the trigger on the market, they signaled to their preferred customers and insiders that now was the time to sell and get their equity out of the market. Those able to sell at the top of the market made substantial profits. With this accomplished, the financial harvest could begin. Over the course of 5 days, the American stock market crash would usher in the coming of the Great Depression. On October 24, 1929, the market crashed 11% on the back of high selling after the opening bell. With such a rapid fall in asset prices, the large brokerage houses and finance lenders immediately issued a coordinated margin call on all their margin loans. The compulsory sale of all these holdings created a stampede of forced selling, leading to a complete collapse of the market. On the 28th of October, the market awakes to a fury of margin selling and drops another 12%. On the 29th of October, the market is down another 11%. Within 1 month, the market had dropped over 120 points, losing over a third of its value. By July 1932, the Dow was down to just 41.22 points, a 90% collapse in value from its record high of 370 in September 1929. It was an economic genocide of retail investors. Drastic scenes of desperate individuals, having lost their entire life savings, jumping out of skyscraper windows stained the public consciousness. Of course, this was not a disaster for everyone. Those who sold at the peak of the market now discovered that they could purchase the very same assets and stocks for pennies on the dollar. Whilst millions were ruined, many others generated colossal fortunes, primarily those connected within the circles of high finance. The reality is that during recessions, the wealth doesn't vanish. It simply gets transferred to different ownership. In the aftermath of the crash, the country is ravaged by a deflation of the currency. As factories began to close, job losses and unemployment became rife. Further compounding the effects of the deflationary spiral was the actions of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. During this period, the Federal Reserve decides to constrict its balance sheet. The Federal Reserve begins selling its financial assets, and the money used by the private banks to purchase these assets was being directly siphoned from the real economy. In a period of economic contraction, the Fed had further exacerbated the depression by deliberately decreasing the currency supply. Much of the human suffering of the American people during this period lays directly at the hands of the actions of the Federal Reserve Board. Meanwhile, the effects of the American market collapse rapidly spread to financial systems across the world, and Australia soon felt the impacts of the global recession. In Australia, banks that had overextended their lending during the boom periods of the 1920s rapidly collapsed, and depositors rushed to the banks in the vain attempt to recover their life savings. Meanwhile, the remaining banking institutions began to outright refuse to extend credit in any form. Loans and overdrafts, which had been the lifeblood of hundreds of industries, were suddenly unavailable. Without the capacity to buy, orders fell and prices collapsed, and after this came the job losses. Although the factories existed, the resources were available, the warehouses were ready to store the goods, the ships were ready to transport, and there were hundreds of thousands of unemployed men ready to work. Without the currency to mobilize the economy, the entire financial system was frozen. It was this deliberate contraction of the currency supply that crippled Australian society throughout the Great Depression. Humanity was being squeezed under the iron grip of the bankers who controlled the currency supply. Food lines and homelessness were the most visible signs of human decay. Huge slums and ghettos of unemployed workers were established, with 1 in 10 families being forced to live in these desolate shanty towns. Evictions of delinquent mortgagees and squatters often turned violent. Tens of thousands of unemployed packed their belongings into swags and began travelling the countryside, wandering aimlessly from dole payment to dole payment, searching for what little work could be found. Within the farming community, conditions were also dire, with importers and manufacturers unable to secure new loans to finance their purchases of primary products. Agricultural prices collapsed. Thousands of farming families faced ruin and were forced into foreclosure. Alcoholism, violence, suicides, and other depravities were rife across the country. Following the 1929 federal election of the new Labor government under James Scullin, himself a former member of O'Malley's Torpedo Brigade, the new Labor Treasurer Red Ted Theodore moved to reactivate the Commonwealth Bank to issue £18 million for public works to provide jobs for the country's 30% unemployment rate. These public works were designed to reinflate the currency supply to get the economy moving again. This was the exact purpose which Dennis and Miller had envisioned that the bank could perform, and the design for which King O'Malley had originally campaigned. Treasurer Theodore attempted to reactivate the note issue and simply generate the currency needed to restart the economy. However, the note issue and the Commonwealth Bank were now under the control of the Commonwealth Bank Board, and the Bank Board outright refused to extend credit in any form. Once again, it is important to recognise that the Treasury had surrendered control over the note issue in 1920. It was Sir Denison Miller's hopes of empowering the Commonwealth Bank into an economic powerhouse that had convinced the government to relinquish its power over the note issue into the hands of the Commonwealth Bank. However, this decision was made at a time when the Commonwealth Bank was operating in the national interest, and relations with government were of a cooperative nature. After the Bruce Page reforms of 1925, the attitude of the new controlling executive of the bank had changed radically. The latter response of the chairman of the board, Sir Robert Gibson, was indicative of the new betrayal of purpose and loyalty of the new controlling class of the bank.
Mr. Prime Minister and members of Cabinet, you asked me to inflate the currency? My answer is that I bloody well won't.
In turn, Australia's economy and the financial position of the Commonwealth government had become dire, with the collapse in the price of Australia's exports falling disproportionately to the cost of its imports. Australia soon faced severe difficulties servicing its debt requirements falling due in London. A debt of £2,770,000 was set to fall due by the Commonwealth to the British government on the 31st of March 1930. It was in February 1930 that the Australian government appealed to the British Treasury for assistance in attaining credit to facilitate these overseas payments. It was in response to this request that Britain decided to send Sir Otto Niemeyer on a voyage to Australia. Niemeyer was a senior banking official at the Bank of England, aged just 47. Niemeyer was one of a number of men who were recruited by the Bank of England's Sir Montague Norman to serve as the lieutenants in his ambition to restructure the bank. Norman aimed to empower the Bank of England as a central institution of British financing and restructure the methods of overseas lending used by British lenders. Australia was seen as a testing ground to enact these new practices, and likely explains why Niemeyer was sent to Australia. Niemeyer had previous financial transactions with the Australian government, as he was the official who had renegotiated the amount owing to England for Australia's war expenses. Niemeyer's task was to travel the country, to gain an understanding of Australia's financial situation, and to provide his recommendations to the government on possible solutions. The Scullin government eagerly welcomed the Bank of England's representative. It appeared that they naively believed that Niemeyer truly aimed to help Australia. He arrives in Perth by boat on the 19th of July 1930 and begins a train journey across to Melbourne. Upon his arrival in Melbourne, he is met by the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank Board, Sir Robert Gibson, and together they take a train journey to Sydney, accompanied by the heads of many of the London-based Melbourne banks. After discussions with Gibson, Niemeyer pushes the Scullin government to secure Gibson's reappointment as chairman of the board. On the 4th of August, the Scullin government agrees, and Gibson is appointed for another 7 years as chairman of the board, even though he still had another year remaining on his original appointment. With this matter settled, Niemeyer begins to present his recommendations to Australia. The next day, on the 5th and 6th of August, Niemeyer organises a meeting of the Loan Council in Canberra. The Loan Council had been an institution developed by the Bruce Page government to centralise overseas financing. Rather than having individual states raising their own loans in London, as was the previous experience, the Loan Council would have sole authority for raising and administrating funds for the states. It would also guarantee London lenders the repayment of state debts. New South Wales was the only state which had refused to join the Loan Council. It was at this meeting of the Loan Council that Niemeyer first laid clear his proposals and recommendations for the Australian economy, with the perspective that it was excessive government borrowing and out-of-control expenditure that were the cause of Australia's monetary woes. In the midst of a global recession, Niemeyer ordered a plan of harsh austerity. There were 5 main provisions to Niemeyer's plan. Firstly, budgets were to be balanced at any cost in human suffering. Second, all overseas borrowing would cease until the short-term indebtedness had been dealt with. Third, no public works were to be undertaken or continued, which would misdirect funds away from the payment of interest or sinking funds for loans. Fourth, all interest payments were to be credited to a special account in the Commonwealth Bank and to be used only in favour of bondholders. And finally, monthly government accounts were to be published in Australia and overseas, detailing summaries of revenue and expenditure. It was these policies that later became known as the Niemeyer Plan. His plan aimed specifically at abandoning tariffs, curbing the emerging manufacturing sector, stopping public works programs, and slashing labour costs. It involved a 25% across-the-board wage cut for all workers, a policy he perceived as vital in order to service repayments to British lenders. It was evident that Niemeyer desired Australia to remain a colonial backwater, subsisting solely from the incomes of primary production, whilst importing British consumer goods. It was paradoxical that he was a steadfast free trade advocate, demanding that Australia tear down its tariffs, despite their continuance having increased the serviceability of London loans. The deliberate attempt to slash import tariffs on British goods was an obvious ploy to save many of the struggling British manufacturing sectors at the expense of the Australian workers. Australia continued to struggle under the burden of interest repayments for its sizable foreign debt. What was most infuriating for many commentators at the time was the aspect that a significant portion of this debt had been incurred by the Australian Commonwealth sending a generation of its young men overseas to the killing fields of the First World War, in service of the British Empire. England had charged Australia for the costs of feeding, billeting, and arming its soldiers in service of an English war. But this was irrelevant. Australia had incurred the wartime debt, and Britain demanded repayment. Following the conclusion of the Loan Council meeting, a conference between the representatives of the individual state governments was organised in Melbourne. At this Premier's Conference, in a speech that lasted over 2 hours, Nehemiah once again presented his policy of austerity and deflation. He also argued for the strengthening of the powers of the Loan Council. The state premiers were convinced, and on the 18th of August 1930, they collectively agreed to adopt Nehemiah's scheme of harsh austerity in service to British bondholders. In the eyes of British banking, the Premier's Conference was an absolute success. State governments, as well as the Commonwealth, had effectively been dictated economic policy from British financial interests, and they were confident that their investments would be repaid. With his mission accomplished, Sir Otto left from Sydney and sailed back to London via Canada on the 13th of November 1930. Nehemiah's doctrine of austerity would continue to permeate Australian finance throughout the Great Depression. Against this backdrop, Red Ted Theodore once again attempted to reactivate the note issue. However, the Commonwealth Bank Board remained adamant in opposing any form of monetary expansion. It was only under the condition of vast reductions of wages and social programs that the Commonwealth Bank would even consider expanding the note issue. Sir Robert Gibson was holding the Australian economy hostage. It was extortion. The Commonwealth government had become completely subservient to the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth Bank Board was committed solely to serving the interests of London bondholders, regardless of the welfare of the Australian people. However, not everyone would bow down to the dictates of the English bankers and their Australian proxies. It is at this point of the story that we must introduce one of the most significant figures in Australian financial history, New South Wales Premier Jack Lang. Nicknamed the Big Fella, he was a strong man with a booming voice, and had been head of the New South Wales opposition when the nationalist New South Wales Premier had agreed to endorse Nehemiah's deflationary policy at the Premier's Conference. Immediately after the conclusion of the Premier's Conference, the New South Wales Labor Party Central Executive had issued a dissenting resolution denouncing the Nehemiah Plan. Lang had already been New South Wales Premier from 1925 to 1927, having gained the premiership by campaigning on issues such as the 44-hour work week and pensions for widows. The principles of his campaign had always been the defence and support of the common working man. Lang was totally opposed to the Nehemiah Plan, and it was campaigning against Nehemiahism that formed the core element of Lang's 1930 New South Wales state election campaign. In a complete contrast, his opponent, Nationals MP Thomas Bavin, had based his campaign on a steadfast implementation of Nehemiah's plan of harsh austerity. Lang won the New South Wales election in a landslide, and in October 1930 formed government. Indeed, Jack Lang's opposition to the brutal austerity of the Nehemiah Plan continued well past his election campaign. Lang was furious that after having sent a generation of its finest young men to die in service to the British Empire, Australia was now being crushed by the interest payments on its wartime debt due to London. Multiple attempts to renegotiate this debt had been rejected. Lang's anger was rightfully intensified due to the fact that England had had large amounts of its own foreign debt to America refinanced at 3%, whilst at the same time outright denying these same concessions to Australia. Nehemiah himself had had significant involvement as the agent for the British Treasury in denying Australia's renegotiation of its war debts. It was at a later Premier's Conference in Canberra on the 9th to the 13th of February 1931 where Jack Lang proposed his own solution to the financial crisis. What later became known as the Lang Plan consisted of 3 main planks. First, until Great Britain agreed to fund Australia's overseas debt, in the same manner as America funded that of Great Britain, no further interest upon her overseas debt should be paid by Australia. Second, that the interest rate on this debt should be reduced to 3%, and that all interest rates on private finance should be correspondingly reduced. Third, that the existing system of currency be altered from a nominal gold standard to one more suited to modern conditions, preferably the good standard. None of the other premiers supported the motions. The Premier of Western Australia, Sir James Mitchell, was more concerned about Australia's international reputation.
I know the interest is too high, but we have agreed to pay it. We must pay it.
Outside the conference, a young rising Victorian politician by the name of Robert Menzies openly declared his opposition to Lang's reforms. If Australia is to surmount her troubles by the abandonment of traditional standards of honesty, justice and fair play, it would be far better for Australia that every citizen within her boundaries should die of starvation during the next few months. Just because the motions were not accepted by the other state premiers did not stop Lang from implementing his own state government policy. It was on the 25th of March 1931 that New South Wales decided to suspend the payment of interest on London loans. The decision was monumental. Jack Lang had essentially declared war on the financial powers of England. In his eyes, the decision was obvious. Faced with the reality of blinded and limbless war veterans wandering the streets of every Australian city, how could they be asked to sacrifice their meagre pensions so that the British bondholders could be paid every penny in full? Why should hundreds of thousands of Australians go without the necessities of life, so that the international money ring shall have its pound of flesh? It was arguments such as these which the big fella used to captivate audiences with his message of people over money. When the New South Wales government defaulted on the payment of interest on British loans, the federal government was contractually obligated to pay the shortfall due to London. Lang himself had been battling against the financial overreach of the federal government for many years. He had refused to join Page's Commonwealth Loan Council, a scheme he asserted was concocted to usurp the states' rights to source their own financing from overseas. By late December 1931, Scullin's Labor government was replaced by the hardline Conservative government of Joe Lyons. In retaliation to this massive financial burden and this open display of anarchy, the new Lyons government swiftly passed the Financial Agreements Enforcement Act of 1932. This gave the federal government the power to confiscate the monetary reserves of the states and hold them under Commonwealth authority. This was a blatant frontal assault on the financial sovereignty of the state governments. In March 1932, the federal government had issued decrees that all banks and New South Wales government institutions that held deposits owned by the New South Wales government must transfer those deposits to the Commonwealth. Before the decrees could be cleared by the High Court, Lang quickly launched a preemptive strike and ordered state officials to withdraw all state money from the banks in cash, over £1 million, and deposited the cash within the basement of the Sydney Trades Hall on Goulburn Street. Lang had withdrawn and stored the entirety of the New South Wales Treasury. Public officials were instructed by a Treasury circular on the 13th of April to collect public funds in cash, money which was not to be deposited in the banks under any circumstances. Public servants, including state politicians, queued at the Trades Hall to receive their wages in cash. Effectively, Lang had turned the New South Wales Treasury into a cash economy. However, the Commonwealth government, so dutifully bound to the Niemeyer doctrine of austerity and balanced budgets, continued battling the New South Wales government to ensure its subservience to the whims of British finance. Despite this, the spirit of Langism was spreading rapidly outside of New South Wales. Similar views were being adopted by the ALP federal members. The new forefront of the Republican movement was rapidly growing, with a strong anti-British sentiment developing across the country. In response to this threat, political agents on behalf of British finance also engineered a split within the Federal Labor Caucus. The Prime Minister, Tasmanian MP Joe Lyons, had led a faction of pro-British Labor MPs who had crossed the floor to join Nationals MP Menzies to form the new Conservative government. This divided the federal Labor movement, significantly hamstringing federal Republican efforts. However, the agents of British finance continued to worry about the growing opposition. They could not place their faith solely within parliamentary structures, particularly when colonial ministers were often inclined to act in the interests of their own people against those of their imperial masters. They could not and would not permit another American-style revolution to occur within one of their colonies. In response, they prepared a backup plan. The Australian proxies of British finance, through Robert Gibson and Melbourne's Baillieu clan of banking houses, secretly began funding the rise of fascist paramilitary groups such as the League of National Security in Victoria and the New Guard in New South Wales. At the time, conditions for the returned soldiers of the First World War were atrocious. Many faced unemployment and were struggling upon the return to civilian life. It was from this large pool of disgruntled war veterans that the core of these paramilitary citizens' armies were formed. The New Guard was formed in early 1931, a year after the League of National Security, and by the start of 1932 it could claim up to 100,000 members, 1 in 4 of which having had combat experience. Groups and chapters were formed all across the state, with local divisions serving as independent vassals for the larger organisation. Drill training, street fighting, and strong-arm salutes portrayed a direct resemblance to paramilitary groups rising across Europe at the time. Publicly stating that their intention was to assist the police in times of unrest and riots, their pro-monarchical beliefs and strong right-wing views meant that they continuously clashed with the trade union movement and other leftist organisations. With the entire New South Wales police force numbering only 3,600, the new guard could within 24 hours' notice deploy a force of over 10 times that amount to any location. It was one of the largest paramilitary organisations within any democratic society. British finance was no stranger to financing fascism. At the same time as the rise of these local paramilitaries, the head of the Bank of England, Sir Montague Norman, was actively channeling money to support the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. Meanwhile, over in the United States, a different battlefield of the exact same war had been raging. Roosevelt had compelled the Federal Reserve to generate credit for infrastructure development through the establishment of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This policy of credit expansion put him in direct conflict with some of the most powerful figures in American business, many of whom had been generating vast fortunes from the economic recession. Rather than accept Roosevelt's policies, this group began plotting a takeover of the government. Fortunately, their plan to establish a fascist dictatorship failed, as the man they had chosen to lead their rebellion was a genuine Democrat, General Smedley Butler. It was in 1934 that General Smedley Butler testified under oath to a House Investigative Committee of the plans for a coup d'etat in America.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions.
However, back in New South Wales, Premier Lang was standing tall against the demands of British finance and the annoyances of the local fascist paramilitaries. On the 19th of March 1932, one of Australia's greatest engineering achievements, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, was completed. Lang had decided to attend the ceremony and officially open the bridge himself. Traditionally, nearly all significant infrastructure and engineering projects were opened by the respective governors as representatives of the monarchy. However, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was the exact type of public work that Niemeyer had ordered to cease with his Premier's plan in August. It was in response to this defiance of austerity that Lang had broken from tradition, announced his intention to open the bridge himself, and stood as a strong symbol of Australian republicanism. This had enraged King George and was not taken lightly by those who supported the monarchy. On the day of the opening ceremony was interrupted by a member of the New Guard. Before Lang could cut the ribbon, Captain Francis de Groot rode across the bridge on horseback and slashed the opening ribbon with his sword. This momentary stalling had little effect, as he was quickly apprehended, the ribbon was rejoined, and the bridge was officially opened by Jack Lang a few moments later. This break from tradition was a bold step towards establishing an Australian republic. However, for the New South Wales government, the situation was critical. Lang had been defaulting on loan repayments, and his direct refusal to submit to the federal government and British finance was generating significant tension. He was being pursued in the High Court by the Commonwealth Government for repayment of the London debt. So far, £3.8 million had been paid by the Commonwealth on behalf of New South Wales. Lang knew how perilous the situation was. The agents of British imperialism could not permit this rebellion to continue. Commonwealth troops stationed in Canberra and Victoria were placed on high alert, ready to deploy into New South Wales. Plans by the New Guard existed for the takeover and operation of the key industries and utilities during a potential revolution. However, Lang was not backing down. Members of the New South Wales police force loyal to Lang were capable of placing Governor Game under house arrest if the need arose, and Lang had appointed Detective Superintendent Billy Mackay as police commissioner to take on the New Guard. In 1932, Australia was on the brink of civil war. However, the bloodshed and takeover by military force never eventuated. Instead, the agents of British finance swiftly executed a coup d'etat by utilising the colonial powers present within the Constitution, the powers which enabled a governor to dismiss an elected government. On the 13th of May 1932, New South Wales Governor Sir Philip Game notified Premier Lang that he was dismissed, and Jack Lang was removed from office. In his place, Game appointed Bertram Stevens as Premier, whose new administration had no problems accessing funds from the Commonwealth. The decision caused an uproar across New South Wales. On the 5th of June 1932, 300,000 to 500,000 people gathered in Sydney's Moore Park in support of Jack Lang, an extraordinary amount considering the population of only 2 million at the time. However, despite the outrage, his dismissal was upheld. Jack Lang's refusal to pay the interest on British-held foreign debt was so revolutionary that if his ideals were adopted on a federal level, it would have been akin to the establishment of a republic in regards to affairs with Britain. It was the largest stand for monetary sovereignty in Australia's history, and if Jack Lang had been truly victorious, Australia today would be a free and sovereign nation. It was for this reason that the architects of the Australian Constitution had included the powers enabling for the removal of government officials by a governor. It was exactly for situations when Australian elected politicians would act in the interests of their own people against those of Imperial Britain that caused the Colonial Office to amend the Constitution in 1901. These powers ensured that no Australian government could ever successfully challenge the authority of imperial rule. The hidden chains of colonial servitude had been revealed, and Australia was chained to the political will of its British masters. Now, during the Great Depression, not all of the private banks had engaged in deflationary policies. However, the banks which had resisted the deflationary policies of their colleagues did not survive long. Banks such as the Government Savings Bank of New South Wales, the Primary Producers Bank of Australia Limited, and the Federal Deposit Bank Limited were all forced to close their doors. Rumours were rapidly spread that these banks were insolvent and incapable of repaying deposits. Bank runs quickly developed, with masses of depositors rushing to withdraw their funds from these institutions. They held out as long as they could but eventually collapsed, even though they were all in financially sound positions. During the First World War, Sir Dennis and Miller had pledged the support of the Commonwealth Bank to guarantee the deposits of any bank which struggled to meet depositor demands. However, under the direction of Robert Gibson, the Commonwealth Bank now refused to extend any such support or guarantee, even though it had the power to do so. These banks had defied the maxim of deflation and austerity and could not be permitted to survive. Ultimately, much of the human suffering and poverty from the Great Depression rests upon the shoulders of Robert Gibson and the refusal of the Commonwealth Bank Board to support the Australian economy. It was during this period that the Commonwealth Bank Act of 1932 was passed, and the Australian banknotes were officially no longer convertible into gold. Instead, they were specified as legal tender. Outside of Australia, central banks were developing like a virus. Central banks were establishing themselves as the monetary authorities of their respective nations, often being private corporations and independent of any government control. In order for these central banks to coordinate economic policy beyond their national boundaries, a larger, grander financial institution was established. In 1930, the Bank for International Settlements was established in Basel, Switzerland. The brainchild for the bank was the head of the Bank of England, Sir Montague Norman. It was originally declared that the purpose of the bank was for the administration of the reparations payments made by Germany after the First World War. Over time, the Bank for International Settlements evolved into an institution where the world's central bankers would gather together to discuss monetary policy and coordinate strategy, becoming in effect the de facto central bank for the central banks. The bank was virtually immune from all laws and jurisdictions. All of its officers enjoyed diplomatic immunity, its assets were immune from seizure, all officials were tax exempt, and the Swiss authorities had no jurisdiction over the BIS building. It was from this vantage point of political immunity that the powers of central banking would coordinate their takeover of the planet. Their true motivations were detailed extensively by Professor Carroll Quigley. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim. Nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the systems was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Upon his return to Europe, Sir Otto Niemeyer, the man who had ruthlessly chastised Australia with his doctrine of austerity, was appointed as a director at the Bank for International Settlements. Due to the horrific humanitarian and social devastations of the Great Depression, Australia had become littered with hundreds of tight-knit, hardline economic reformers and philosophers, intent on reforming the monetary system for the better. One such opportunity for reform was the 1935 Tasmanian Banking Inquiry, chaired by independent candidate George Simpson Carruthers. With 15 Labor members and 14 Nationalist-favoured members elected to the House of Assembly in the 1932 Tasmanian state election, as an independent candidate, Carruthers held the crucial decision of power to determine the fate of the future Tasmanian government. In exchange for his support to the O'Bligh Labor government, Carruthers was granted his select committee into the monetary system, which he himself was to be the chairman. Tasked with investigating whether there were financial and monetary mechanisms which had prevented the Australian people from receiving the economic benefits from the last 3 decades of production, his long and dutiful investigation into the private banking houses and their architectures of credit creation served as a deep inquiry into the heart of the Australian monetary system. With over 18 meetings, it interviewed and cross-examined some of the biggest figures in Tasmanian finance and economics. Carruthers himself stated in the final report that there is an evident attempt on the part of monopolistic organisations to keep the people ignorant of facts which might lead them to change the system. The final recommendations of his committee were restoration to the sovereign community of effective control over money in all its forms, and the establishment by the Commonwealth Parliament of machinery which would secure regular equation between the community's production and the community's purchasing power. This recommendation for the restoration over control of the money supply only grew in significance. Particularly amongst Labour MPs, there was the view that private banking had been the source of much of the community's ills over the past decade. In response, the idea of a government takeover of the banking apparatuses was becoming more and more popular. This feeling manifested in policy when by 1934 the nationalisation of the private banks had become a major plank of Labour's federal election campaign. Further investigations into Australia's banking system were also conducted. In 1937, the Australian government launched the Royal Commission into the Monetary and Banking Systems. Tasked with investigating the monetary and banking systems of Australia and reporting on whether there are any desirable alterations that could be made to benefit Australia as a whole, it called on witnesses and experts in an effort to investigate Australia's financial system. It even took evidence from previous banking committees held in England, such as the 1931 British Macmillan Committee, that discovered that the banks were unwilling to extend credit to develop the manufacturing sector. The inquiry possessed a broad terms of reference, enabling the committee to investigate the structural components of the banking system. The result of the commission was a report which called for considerable increases in the central banking functions and powers of the Commonwealth Bank. They argued that a strong central bank, based upon international best standard, was the best model for the Australian economy. However, the subject of bank nationalisation was not a large concern within this inquiry. One prominent member of the commission was the later Prime Minister Ben Chifley, who had been a protege of the fierce monetary critic Labour MP Frank Anstey. It was within this inquiry where Chifley substantially widened his knowledge of economics and finance. Chifley himself argued that the Commission's recommendations didn't go far enough and wrote a dissenting report to this effect. Within this dissenting report, he advocated for the full nationalisation of all private banking. As Australia and the rest of the world emerged from the ravages of the Great Depression, the role of the Commonwealth Bank was once again revived and strengthened with the outbreak of the Second World War. With the war effort building, the Commonwealth Government once again prepared itself financially for the monetary effects of a war. Although the Royal Commission had presented its report, the Lyons-Menzies government had refused to implement any of its findings or recommendations. However, in 1941, the Menzies government was defeated on its attempts to pass the budget and was replaced by the new Curtin Labor government. Labour had returned to power. With John Curtin as the new Prime Minister and with Ben Chifley as his Treasurer, together they promptly announced that the government will adopt many of the findings of the recent Royal Commission. It is because of the wartime powers that they are able to adopt these measures. Immediately, the Commonwealth Bank is granted a raft of new authoritative powers issued directly under the National Security Economic Organisation regulations. A range of policies were introduced which strengthened the Commonwealth Bank and formally positioned it towards the role of Australia's central bank, bringing the private banks under its supervision. Wartime profits of the private banks were required to be deposited within the Commonwealth Bank, ensuring that the private bank's profits were stabilised during the war, preventing excessive bank lending, and prevented wartime inflation. All banks were required to obtain a licence from the government and provide financial audits of their stability if requested. They would follow the advanced policies of the Commonwealth Bank and would not sell government securities without the consent of the bank. Soon later, the Commonwealth Bank began to control the interest rate. Although there were hounds of protest from the private banks, even from the Commonwealth Bank Board itself, Chifley was still under pressure from the monetary reformists within the Labour Party to continue adopting further bank regulation. The bank that O'Malley had campaigned for was born. Although the Labour government at the time was intent on empowering and strengthening the capabilities of the Commonwealth Bank, it was obvious by the actions of the Commonwealth Bank Board that the board was not acting in the same manner that Sir Denison Miller's Commonwealth Bank had acted previously during the First World War. During the war effort, the Curtin government utilised the Commonwealth Bank to once again fund the war effort. One of the major policies of the Curtin government was the establishment of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, whose first minister would be Ben Chifley. Together with several captains of industry, such as the general manager of BHP, Essington Lewis, who became general of munitions and later of aircraft production, they would reorganise Australian industry to support the physical production required for the war effort. One of the grand successes of the ministry was the development of a world-class machine tools building industry from scratch. By the end of the war, the industry would continue to expand rapidly. However, there was a fatal flaw with the ministry. Chifley appointed H.C. Nugget Coombs to serve as the ministry's first Director General in January 1943. Coombs was educated at the London School of Economics and was a dogmatic supporter of Nehemiah's doctrine of austerity and deflation. Many of the projects and attempts to finance reconstruction through infrastructure created by the ministry were frustrated due to Coombs. In his memoir, he later explained, "I argued that to prevent Australian prices from rising dangerously, it would be necessary to limit development works, to budget for a substantial surplus, to free interest rates, and to tighten the supply of bank loans." Once again, a war had proved to be a substantial financial burden on the Commonwealth. By the end of the Second World War, the total financial cost for Australia equaled over $4.7 billion US. $3 billion of this came in the form of debt financing, whilst $1.7 billion worth had been raised through taxation. However, the philosophical question must again be acknowledged. Why should Australia plunge itself into debt to finance wartime spending, when theoretically the bank could create as much interest-free currency as they required? If Australia had created the credit itself, instead of borrowing it at interest, Australia would have been free from the substantial debt burdens and interest repayments it was now forced to endure. It would have only required a parliamentary act to restore the note issue back into the hands of Parliament and regain this power that was possessed only 3 decades prior. There was even historical precedent for this type of action. Abraham Lincoln had taken control of the currency in the 19th century and began issuing his greenback currency to finance the Union's spending during the Civil War. It had been done before. As the war was coming to an end, Curtin and Chifley prepared new legislation that would ensure that the wartime reforms they had made to the Commonwealth Bank would remain permanent after the war was over. They introduced 2 bills, the Commonwealth Banking Act of 1945 and the Banking Act of 1945. The Commonwealth Banking Act granted the Commonwealth Bank a raft of powers. It retained many of the wartime powers as an unofficial central bank, including controls over the trading banks, control of gold and foreign reserves, advances and investments. The bank was also authorised to extend its lending activities through divisions such as the Rural Credits Department, the Mortgage Bank Department, and the new Industrial Finance Department. Most importantly, the Act abolished the Commonwealth Bank Board, and control over the bank was once again placed back into the hands of a governor. If government and bank policy differed, the bank was then required to implement government policy. In short, Curtin and Chifley had rescued and restored the Commonwealth Bank back into public hands. The Banking Act of 1945 gave the Commonwealth Bank vast powers over the private trading banks. It granted the power for the Commonwealth Bank to assume control over private banks in financial difficulties, control over the interest rates, and establish the wartime special account system as permanent, requiring the private banks to store vast amounts of deposits within the Commonwealth Bank. The legislation is passed, and the Commonwealth Bank was placed in a very powerful position. The leader of the opposition, Robert Menzies, at the time boldly declared, "If we on this side of the chamber are returned to office in the future, we shall take prompt steps to restore board control to the Commonwealth Bank, with political independence for the Commonwealth Bank functions." Despite this, Curtin and Chifley had restored the Commonwealth Bank back to its original function, and they utilised the Commonwealth Bank to fund Australia's development after the war. Much of the post-war effort of the Ministry for Post-War Reconstruction was converting the economic power of the military-industrial complex back into civilian industries. By this time, Curtin had died, and Chifley had taken over as the new Prime Minister. With the establishment of the Industrial Finance Department through the use of overdrafts and higher purchase terms, credit was extended into industrially productive areas. Later, the government would finance the establishment of an Australian automobile industry through a partnership with American-based General Motors Holden. On November 1948, the first Holden car was presented to the public. Ben Chifley attended the debut ceremony. It was through grand investments such as these, through which the future of Australia's manufacturing sector would emerge. The war years also led to the introduction of a raft of welfare programs and social services to assist the poor. With the passing of the Re-establishment and Employment Act in 1946, the Commonwealth Employment Service is established, with the goal of achieving full employment. It provided jobs and benefits for those seeking work and rapidly lowered the unemployment rate. Australia was rapidly booming in the aftermath of the Second World War. However, Chifley's banking reforms were not left unchallenged. When a section of the 1945 Banking Act was declared invalid by the High Court, the section requiring all government municipal bodies to bank with the Commonwealth Bank, the Chifley government put forth one of the most radical bills for financial reform in Australian history. They introduced the Banking Act of 1947, which empowered the Commonwealth Bank by enabling the Commonwealth Bank to take over the banking business and properties of the private banks, and also prohibited the private banks from conducting business in Australia. This was a direct frontal assault on the private banking system. Never before had such an audacious move against the banks been attempted in Australian history, and if it had been successful, it would have been the end of the private banking cartels inside Australia. Immediately after the public announcement of Labor's intention to nationalise the banks, the general managers of 8 of Australia's private trading banks hold a private meeting. In this room, Australia's most powerful men gathered to discuss, organise and strategise their resistance to the most significant threat they had ever faced. Immediately, the banks and the unions of bank workers begin organising rallies in opposition to the bill. Attack ads and propaganda flood the media, decrying Chifley's nationalisation as the march towards socialism and the end of freedom. Meanwhile, Chifley's supporters continue their support in the battle against the banks. Eventually, the legislation is challenged. The government was taken to the High Court by arguing that the government was overreaching its constitutional authority, and thus the legislation was invalid. In 1947, the High Court supports these arguments, and Chifley's legislation is declared invalid, and whole sections of the Banking Act are dismissed. The Commonwealth does not accept this decision, and takes the matter to the highest court in the land. In late 1948, they launch an appeal to the Privy Council. In July 1949, the Privy Council rejects this appeal, and the Banking Act of 1947 was declared invalid. The momentum for nationalisation of all private banking had been defeated, and with this victory, the private banking fraternities breathed a massive sigh of relief. Meanwhile, outside of Australia, a global war had once again drastically altered the structures of global finance. It was during the final years of the war, whilst Russian soldiers were storming across the fields of the Ukraine, and whilst American and British troops pushed upwards through Italy, that the plans were being prepared for the new architectures of global finance that were to emerge when the war was over. On the 1st to the 22nd of July 1944, the representatives of all the world's major Allied economies gathered at the high-class Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, over in the United States. It would later be known as the Bretton Woods Conference, and it was here that the financial architectures for the post-war economic system were presented and adopted. The Australian delegation of representatives consisted of Sir Leslie Melville, Sir Frederick Wheeler, and Sir Arthur Tange. There are multiple conflicting historical perspectives on what actually occurred at the Bretton Woods Conference. Some accounts report sessions comprised of fierce economic debates and discussions. Other sources tell a story of delegates having arrived only to find that the final agreement had already been written and was only awaiting the signatures of the international delegates. Regardless of the process, the end result of the conference was clear. There was to be a new global financial architecture, and the United States of America would be the nexus of it all. Interestingly, the Bretton Woods Conference had actually agreed on the dissolution of the Bank for International Settlements. The conference recommended the liquidation of the Bank for International Settlements at the earliest possible moment. However, it was opposed by the British representative John Maynard Keynes. The British government later suspended the dissolution, and in 1948 the decision was officially reversed. By the end of the conference, the Articles of Agreement were signed and the new post-war economic order had been decided upon. The most significant reform was the establishment of the US dollar as the new global reserve currency. Massive note printing to finance war efforts around the world had led to a detachment of the value of currencies relative to the national holdings of gold. In contrast, the United States had made a significant fortune off of the war. By providing weapons and supplies to the Allies, the United States was now in possession of over 2/3 of the world's gold supply. It was from this position of economic superiority that the United States negotiated the future of the global financial system. It was decided that all of the currencies in the world would be taken off of the gold standard. Instead, only the US dollar would be exchangeable for gold, which itself would be valued at $35 an ounce. All other currencies would then be pegged to the US dollar at varying exchange rates. It was this system that established the US dollar as the global reserve currency, enabling it to dominate international trade and finance for the decades to come. Beyond establishing the global currency system, the conference also led to the establishment of two key global financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would later become the World Bank. The publicly stated intentions of these institutions were noble in intent. The IMF supposedly would secure the stability of the global financial system by providing rescue packages and bailout money to struggling economies. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development would provide investment money for the rebuilding of nations and infrastructure. The international private banks and financiers would also be invited to subscribe to these loans. However, over time, the actions of these institutions would prove that the World Bank served more as a mechanism for saddling poorer nations with huge unpayable debt burdens, whilst the IMF would act as a vicious loan shark, ransacking defaulting economies through predatory financial reforms. Voting privileges in these organisations were not allocated based upon the size of a country's population, but rather upon the size of the financial contributions that a country contributed to the fund. As the United States gave the largest contributions by far, these new institutions became dominated by the Americans. Back in Australia, the federal government decided in November 1946 to ratify the Bretton Woods Agreement, and in late March 1947 the International Monetary Agreements Act passed both houses. Now this can be considered one of the key mistakes of the Chifley government. Having just rescued and restored the Commonwealth Bank from the clutches of the Bank Board, Chifley had now made the mistake of homogenising Australia within the new architecture of global finance. There was fierce debate within the Labor Party over whether Australia should even join these international treaties. Labor Minister Eddie Ward, a loyal supporter of New South Wales Premier Jack Lang, claimed on national radio, "I am convinced that the agreement will enthrone a world dictatorship of private finance more complete and terrible than any Hitlerite dream. It offers no solution of world problems, but quite blatantly sets up controls which will reduce the smaller nations to vassal states, and make every government the mouthpiece and tool of international finance. World collaboration of private financial interests can only mean mass unemployment, slavery, misery, degradation and financial destruction. Therefore, as freedom-loving Australians, we should reject this infamous proposal." With the bill passed on the 5th of August 1947, Labor Minister Macon signs the membership agreements in Washington, D.C. We were the 45th nation to enter its servitude. Up to $400 million worth of government funds had been allocated towards subscription payments and quota contributions to join the funds. By the 30th of June 1948, Australia's contributions to the international funds were substantial. 240,138 ounces of fine gold, with a value at the time of over $8 million had been handed over to the IMF. Over £20 million in Australian currency in cash was deposited in an account in the fund's name at the Commonwealth Bank, alongside $171 million worth of special security bonds, being non-negotiable, non-interest-bearing demand notes in favour of the IMF, which were also held in an account at the Commonwealth Bank. The subscription to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development came at a cost equivalent to $40 million. 114,286 ounces of pure gold was transferred to the International Bank, whilst $36 million worth of special security bonds were also deposited in an account at the Commonwealth Bank on behalf of these international financiers. With our subscriptions paid, Australia became a loyal member of the new international financial order, and so began the reign of the IMF and the World Bank. In 1950, Sir Leslie Melville, the man who had negotiated on behalf of Australia at the Bretton Woods Conference, would later become Australia's executive director for both the IMF and the World Bank. By the end of World War II, significant amounts of American investment began pouring into Australia. By 1947, it had already accumulated to over $2 billion. Meanwhile, significant domestic political changes once again altered the structure of the Commonwealth Bank. After the failed campaign to nationalise the banks and impacted heavily by the death of Curtin, Labor is defeated in the 1949 federal election to the Liberal Party of Robert Menzies. The man who had said it would be preferable that every Australian citizen starve to death rather than default on its loan repayments had returned to hold Australia's highest office. Immediately, the new Menzies government announces the closure of the Ministry of Post-War Reconstruction. Consequently, Menzies appoints H.C. Nugget Coombs, the man who had frustrated many of the projects of the Ministry for Post-War Reconstruction, as the new governor of the Commonwealth Bank. Coombs possessed none of the economic nationalist loyalty of Sir Denison Miller. Rather, having been educated at the London School of Economics, he was a dogmatic supporter of Nehemiah's doctrine of austerity and balanced budgets, regardless of the human cost to the Australian people. In his memoirs, he would later proudly boast that he was a member of the International Freemasonry of Central Bankers, an indication of where his loyalties truly lay. With a new governor appointed, Menzies sets forth to reign in the Commonwealth Bank. The Menzies government introduces the Commonwealth Bank Act of 1951, which once again removed the position of governor and re-established the Bank Board as the controlling executive authority over the bank. In the event of a disagreement between the bank and government policy, the Governor-General now had the authority to determine the policy of the bank. Curtin and Chifley's reforms had effectively been overturned, and the money power had once again reclaimed control over the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. More legislation by Menzies followed suit. The Commonwealth Bank Act of 1953 established the Commonwealth Trading Bank as a separate body to take over the existing General Banking Division of the Commonwealth Bank. Multiple other banking bills designed to amend the Australian banking system continued to be rejected by the Senate. However, with the 1958 federal election, the Liberal Country Party maintained its majority in the House of Reps, whilst also gaining majority in the Senate. With the vote secured, Menzies introduces one of the most significant pieces of Australian financial legislation. Menzies introduces the Reserve Bank Act of 1959, which is quickly passed. The Commonwealth Bank was officially renamed the Reserve Bank of Australia, and reforms were implemented to establish this new institution as Australia's official central bank. The new Reserve Bank of Australia would control the note issue, administer the statutory reserve deposit provisions, exchange mechanisms, acquisitions and the sale of gold, protection of deposit accounts in other banks, determine lending policy, and regulate the interest rate. The other functions of the original Commonwealth Bank, the Commonwealth Trading Bank, the Commonwealth Savings Bank, and the Commonwealth Development Bank, were all transferred under the new institution called the Commonwealth Banking Corporation. This would be a separate entity from the new Reserve Bank of Australia. The man to be the first governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia was to be H.C. Nugget Coombs, the man who would openly declare himself as a member of the International Freemasonry of Central Bankers. With this bill, the Commonwealth Bank had finally been neutralised. In its place now stood the grand new institution of financial authority, the Reserve Bank of Australia, led by a man whose allegiance was not towards Australia, but rather the international fraternity of global finance. With this new domestic system established, the RBA would continue to control the Australian financial system to this very day. On the 14th of February 1966, Australia switched over from pounds, shilling and pence into a decimal currency. Made famous by this currency jingle, the transition was relatively seamless and successful.
In come the dollars, in come the cents, to replace the pounds and the shillings and the pence. Be prepared, folks, when the coins begin to mix on the 14th of February 1966.
Meanwhile, the global currency system that was established at the Bretton Woods Conference wouldn't last forever. Due to hyperinflationary pressures from Vietnam wartime spending and continual withdrawals upon American gold reserves, the Bretton Woods system of a gold-backed American currency was at the brink of collapse. It was in 1971 that American President Richard Nixon shocked the world and announced the end of the gold-backed US dollar.
I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
By suspending gold convertibility, the world had completely abandoned the gold standard, and as such, the world's currencies were fiat currencies. Their value was only based upon the faith that their currencies could be exchanged for national goods. Such a system could not guarantee the United States its place as a global reserve currency, and thus plans were implemented to reclaim US financial supremacy. It was in the early 1970s that the petrodollar system began to take shape. The brainchild of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who had long been unofficially regarded as a bagman for the Rockefeller factions, he had negotiated a powerful agreement with the Saudi royal family. The deal was that the Middle Eastern oil-producing nations would sell their oil exclusively in US dollars and would reinvest these excess funds back into American assets such as US Treasury bonds and securities. In exchange, the Saudis and the other oil-exporting nations received a guarantee of political security and military protection by the United States from their primary enemy in the region, Israel, alongside generous imports of military aid and weaponry. This deal was negotiated during the 1973 oil crisis, which had seen the price of oil rise by nearly 400%. The Saudis knew a good deal when they saw one, and by 1974 the system was fully operational in Saudi Arabia. By 1975, all of the OPEC nations were selling their oil exclusively in US dollars. The supremacy of the US dollar was maintained. For the next few decades, all transactions for oil were undertaken solely with US dollars, greatly increasing its demand, artificially inflating its value, and securing its place as the world's reserve currency for decades to come. Meanwhile, back in Australia, the winds of change were also blowing strongly. With the election of Gough Whitlam's Labor Party in December 1972, significant changes were occurring across the Australian social and political landscape. Having ended military conscription, introduced universal healthcare, and free university education, the early 70s were a time of great change in Australian government. What was of most significance was Whitlam's policy of buying back the farm. Within Australia, much of the industrial oligarchy had been developed primarily with financial backing from British and American institutions. These substantial investments, however, led to significant profit outflows. According to the New York Times, by 1969, the outflow of profits from investment in Australia flowing back to America had reached over $320 million a year. By the mid-1960s, more than one-third of the total value of Australia's mineral and fossil fuel production was controlled by non-Australian ventures. By 1967, that number had risen to more than 53%. In the minerals sector, by 1974, over 70% was held in foreign hands. Faced with this reality, a primary policy of Whitlam's government was to reclaim Australian ownership over Australia's natural resources, and to then develop the secondary manufacturing industries from these resources. The mantra of buying back the farm became the rallying call for a fierce strand of economic nationalism. Whitlam's two primary compatriots on this endeavour were Dr. James Ford Cairns, his Minister for Overseas Trade, and Rex Connor, his Minister for Minerals and Energy. Together they established a plan for the purchase and development of Australia's mineral resources. If the funding could be secured, the plans detailed multiple natural resource and energy projects, including the building of a natural gas pipeline, the electrification of interstate railways, and a uranium enrichment plant. The plan also involved the establishment of government bodies with the authority to oversee the development and investment of key areas of mining and oil. Connor at the time estimated that Australia's energy and mineral reserves could be worth more than $5.7 trillion, and that this wealth rightly belonged to the Australian people. However, in order to finance these plans, the government would require huge sums of money. Since his re-election in 1974, Whitlam had continued to face Senate opposition which prevented him passing bills of supply through Parliament. Since the establishment of the petrodollar, the Middle East was flushed with extra cash and seemed an attractive source of funds to secure such a loan. In 1974, Whitlam instructed both Connor and Cairns to find a Middle Eastern source for a $4 billion loan. This was to be the beginning of the so-called loans affair, which would significantly damage the Whitlam government. The loan never eventuated, and the ministers involved eventually lost their positions. On the 4th of June 1975, Dr. Cairns was removed from the cabinet, having allegedly misled Parliament over a signed letter regarding a 2.5% commission rate on the loan. Rex Connor's authority to raise a loan had been revoked in early 1975, and he was forced to resign in October after the Melbourne Herald published documents of his continued correspondence with Pakistani banker Kemlani. He was replaced by a young Paul Keating. The loan never eventuated, and with it, the momentum to break away from colonial subservience and imperialistic looting was significantly hampered. It was for situations like these which the original Commonwealth Bank under Sir Denison Miller could have provided the funds and rescued Australia from imperial servitude. A nationalistic banking system could have utilised the national credit to purchase back these Australian assets from foreign hands, and utilise the wealth for the common advancement of Australia. However, Sir Miller's bank had long since been destroyed, and now Australia continued onwards without it. At the same time, relations with America were souring rapidly. Whitlam had been a vigorous opponent of the Vietnam War, and within 7 days of his election had announced the final withdrawal of all troops from Vietnam. Emerging evidence of American deep state drug smuggling in Australia through fronts such as the Nugan Hand Bank, and rising contentions over the continuation of the American military base Pine Gap, proved to be the final provocation to the imperial powers. Whitlam was bucking from colonial bondage, refusing the Australian government's place as a mere vassal state, and as such the Americans and the British prepared to oust a democratically elected Australian government. When Whitlam had been re-elected for a second term, the White House had decided to send their man Marshall Green to serve as US ambassador to Australia. Green was notorious for his involvement in the 1965 Indonesian coup against Sukarno, playing a central role, having served as the US ambassador to Indonesia during the transition to Suharto, and with such experience he stared down the Australian government. However, once again there was no need for a violent coup d'etat or military overthrow, which was so common across Latin America at this time. Instead, the British simply utilised the Governor-General powers present within the Australian Constitution. It was on the 11th of November that Governor-General Kerr notified Whitlam that he was dismissed as Prime Minister. On the steps of Parliament House, Whitlam gave this famous speech decrying the travesty of his removal.
Well may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
With Malcolm Fraser commissioned as caretaker Prime Minister, the chains of colonialism were rapidly reshackled and the momentum out of colonial servitude had been stifled once again. This was the second time that the position of the Governor-General had been utilised to overthrow a democratically elected Australian government. There are certain issues, certain political battles, that whenever the Australian political will grows strong enough, the covered hand of imperial power returns to assert itself. It is a form of colonialism, subtle and hidden, that only emerges when the structural form of its power is threatened. It is this system which keeps Australia chained, and until it is reformed, Australia will never be a truly sovereign nation. At the same time, the principles of the old Labor Party failed to make a comeback within Australian politics. Labor MP Rex Patterson had presented a plan titled Labor's Federal Rural Policies, which strongly advocated for the reutilisation of the Commonwealth Bank to finance low-interest loans to rescue farmers and primary producers from high-interest conditions. However, upon Whitlam's election, he was thrust onto the backbench, and into the position of Minister for Primary Industry was a man by the name of Al Grasby, a man who disregarded these policies entirely, and was gung-ho with internationalism. Any reforms towards the restoration of national banking failed to gather momentum. Whitlam, while strongly nationalist in regards to our colonial heritage and English-American relations, in many ways he assisted and served the globalist agenda. He delivered speech after speech on the importance of the new international economic order, whilst removing many of Australia's manufacturing tariffs. This was during a period where globalisation was advancing at full steam. Countries were rapidly opening their borders and their markets to the tentacles of the new transnational corporations. The Lima Declaration was an international agreement originating from a division within the United Nations. Signed in Lima, Peru, it committed First World nations to transferring capital and industry to the Third World, alongside granting those nations preferred import status back into their countries. Whitlam voluntarily signed Australia onto this agreement, which would later receive strong support from Malcolm Fraser, and the deindustrialisation of Australia in service of the globalist agenda began. Australia had committed itself towards the new age of internationalism. Coinciding with this embrace of internationalism emerged the rise of neoliberalism, pushing expansive deregulation, the privatisation of government utilities, vast austerity of social programs, and a dogmatic adoration for the ideology of supposed free market economics. The neoliberal ideology took hold of governments globally. There was one group in particular responsible for this ideology, the Mont Pelerin Society. Founded in Switzerland in 1947, it was from this intellectual nexus that policy direction seeped into Australia. Through its Australian fronts such as the Centre for Independent Studies, the Institute for Public Affairs, the Tasman Institute, and the H.R. Nichols Society, the ideology of neoliberalism, free market economics and laissez-faire deregulation permeated the Australian political system, and the Australian public has paid the heavy price ever since. By the 1980s, neoliberalism had reached the banking sector, and Australia prepared itself for a raft of financial deregulation. Over the next decade, the Australian financial system changed from one of the most controlled banking systems in the world to one of the least controlled. It was the Australian Financial Systems Inquiry, known as the Campbell Committee, set up by the Fraser government in 1979, that laid the groundwork for extensive banking deregulation. They issued their final report in 1981. When Hawke's Labor government came to power in 1983, it appointed another committee called the Martin Committee to review the findings of the previous Campbell Committee. With the Martin report approving the recommendations of the previous Campbell report, the new Labor government was given the green light and embarked headfirst into an extensive deregulation of Australia's financial system. The new Labor governments, both under Hawke and later Keating, had long abandoned the old Labor principles of O'Malley and Chifley in the struggle against the money power. Instead, New Labour would be gung-ho with globalisation, combined with a dogmatic devotion towards deregulation. In December 1983, the controls over the use of foreign exchange were removed and the Australian dollar was floated on the foreign exchange market. Rather than facilitating easier transnational trade, 98% of the foreign exchange transactions were undertaken by speculators seeking to profit off the movement of the currencies. The value of the Australian dollar was now hostage to the whims of the speculators. The freeing of the foreign exchange market was followed by the granting of licenses to deal in foreign exchange to many non-bank entities. Soon Australia was awash with firms trading currencies on the open market. The floating of the dollar led to a huge amount of foreign direct investment, and alongside these inflows followed a raft of new foreign institutions into Australia. The regulations on foreign banking in Australia were relaxed, and very quickly 15 new foreign banks set up branches in Australia. Trading banks and savings banks were also no longer distinguished from one another. There was no difference in the eyes of the authorities between a savings bank, which gathered deposits, and a trading bank, which speculated with currency. The trading banks would later use the safety and capital provided by their savings deposits to engage in increasingly riskier speculation. One Australian institution that epitomised Australia's new financial insanity was Macquarie Bank. In 1985, Macquarie Bank Limited was granted the authority to engage in trading bank activities. Quickly soon it generates the nickname as the Millionaire Factory, as with the raft of deregulations, it sets about engaging in brand new markets. Facilitating privatisation and the sale of public assets, it traded on commodities and foreign exchange, and a range of other financial activities. Soon it became one of Australia's largest private banking institutions. In short, with the financial deregulations of the 1980s and 1990s, Australia had become a banking Wild West. The financial industry had evolved into a global casino, and the bankers and the traders became addicted to gambling. Alongside the rise of the financial industry came significant amounts of fraud and white-collar financial crime. Notable figures of the time included Alan Bond, Christopher Skates, and Laurie Connell, all of whom amassed great fortunes in this new era of credit lines and takeovers. However, they all rapidly faced bankruptcy and left their creditors to suffer the losses. The laissez-faire approach to regulation had overtaken banking and the economy, with Australia doomed to suffer the aftermath. Under the influence of institutions such as the Mont Pelerin Society, Australia began a raft of privatisations, selling many of the publicly owned assets to private investors. It was during this period that the final nail was placed in the Commonwealth Bank's coffin. In January 1991, Prime Minister Keating announces that the government will sell a large stake of its ownership in the Commonwealth Bank. With initial public offering, the shares were issued at $5.40 a share. By September 1991, the CBA was listed on the ASX and became a publicly traded stock. By November 1993, the government had sold 49.6% of the bank. By July 1996, the government had completely sold all of its ownership in the bank. Whilst the sale of the bank was extremely profitable for those who bought the shares, the privatisation was a financial disaster for the Commonwealth government. The total proceeds from the sale totaled around $7.8 billion. Meanwhile, the annual profits of the bank since 1988 sat at around $560 million a year. Thanks to the financial deregulation and the removal on the restrictions of banking, the banks had become more profitable than ever. If the government had just kept ownership of the bank would have been valued at over $11.2 billion, meaning that the privatisation had cost the government $3.5 billion alongside losing ownership of the bank. With its final privatisation, the government had surrendered complete control over the ownership of the bank, and the Commonwealth Bank was unrecognisable. Gone was the spirit of Sir Denison Miller, whose bank had utilised the public credit to so much benefit in service of the nation. No longer did the bank stand as a symbol of Australia's wealth and sovereignty. Rather, it had homogenised itself within the cabal of private banks it had once competed against and so terrified. The Commonwealth Bank had become a private institution, utilising its credit creation powers for profit and usury. The bank had become a vapid corpse of its former glory. The original Commonwealth Bank was gone. With an unleashed banking system and waves of extensive deregulation, the private banks became some of the most profitable institutions in the country. By the late 1990s, a stock market bubble known as the dot-com boom had taken over global markets, only to rapidly burst in the early 2000s. China was growing rapidly upon the back of a massive credit expansion, and with an explosion of construction development possessed an insatiable demand for raw materials. This high demand led to even higher prices for mineral exports, and Australia was in the perfect position to capitalise on this increase. Australia's mining boom had begun. The Australian dollar became a commodity currency, its rate unofficially pegged to the value of its primary exports. Jobs for mining workers in outback Western Australia and Queensland attracted six-figure salaries, and fortunes were being generated rapidly. However, with the failure of Gough Whitlam's buy back the farm policy, many of the profits from this bonanza were heading directly overseas to the foreign owners of the Australian projects. The big foreign-owned mining companies were paying comparatively very little tax on the gigantic amount of revenues they were generating from Australian mineral resources. Sophisticated schemes of tax avoidance and transfer pricing meant that often companies were mining resources in Australia and then selling the materials to subsidiaries in countries such as Singapore or the Cayman Islands at dirt cheap prices in order to avoid paying the full duties expected. Meanwhile, other countries were utilising their resources booms for longer-term ambitions. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund was established off the royalties of the Norwegian oil boom and is today one of the largest private equity trusts in the world. Australia, in contrast, had absolutely no such ambitions. Later, Kevin Rudd's super profits tax was a meagre attempt at redressing this mismanagement. However, it was far too little, far too late, and with significant opposition it failed to pass through Parliament. The global financial crisis began in 2007, and when it hit hard in 2008, the American and the global economy began to crash. private banks had once again been extending credit to borrowers without the means to pay them back. The subprime mortgage crisis, combined with an unprecedented amount of derivatives gambling on housing securities, led to a global economic meltdown. It was only with a bailout totaling over $7 trillion given directly to the large, too-big-to-fail banks, that the system avoided a complete collapse. During this time, Australia outwardly appeared to ride strong throughout the crisis, holding steady with high commodity prices combined with a stable and comparatively isolated banking system. Labor Treasurer Wayne Swan was even awarded the World's Best Treasurer Award for his so-called excellent managing of the Australian economy. At this point, Australia had not had a recession in over 17 years. However, with the global economic slowdown, China's demand slowed, and eventually the prices of iron ore and other commodities collapsed. Iron ore went from a peak of $195 a tonne in February 2008 to a bottom of $63 a tonne in March 2009. The glory days of the mining boom were over. The Australian economy needed to restructure itself to guarantee its future prosperity. The source for Australia's future economic growth was to be housing and real estate. Australia's banking regulator APRA reformed its regulations upon mortgage sales, permitting higher commissions and lower income requirements, and with this achieved, the banks initiated aggressive lending policies, generating huge amounts of private bank credit through mortgages. This newly created money flowed directly into the property market, and the Australian property bubble began to boom. With all this new money, real estate and land values continued to rise. Thousands of new apartment buildings and housing developments began across Australia, as the rapid capital gains made many housing investments exceedingly profitable. With the banks willing to lend to anyone who fit their lenient lending criteria, mortgages expanded rapidly. Negative gearing tax incentives meant that property investors could claim tax deductions upon their mortgages when interest payments were larger than the net rental income of their properties, which effectively provided a government subsidy for property investment. As long as Australian property values continued to rise, the capital gains made off these investments meant that most Australian property investments continued to remain lucrative. The result of these lending practices was that the median price for a home rapidly outstripped affordable levels. Both Sydney and Melbourne became some of the most unaffordable cities for housing in the world. First home buyers were discovering that they were forced to take on massive debt burdens to purchase their homes. Banks were readily lending in excess of 15 years total income, often with interest-only mortgages with no real expectation that the principal sums would be paid back. The result of these actions was that Australia soon had the highest private debt to GDP ratio in the world. Under the veil of economic growth and housing development, the banking system had grown out of control, and the Australian people had become further enslaved to the system of banking. Few people were questioning the structural mechanisms that were the source of this economic growth. As the public debate shifted aimlessly between affordability and reforms over negative gearing, little attention was given to the massive expansion of private bank credit, which had fueled the entire bubble. During this housing boom, the balance sheets of the private banks had expanded substantially. It was not the housing boom that had increased the size of the banks, but rather it was a massive expansion in bank lending that had caused the property boom. Within the banking sector itself, financial fraud was rife. Mortgage lenders consistently falsified signatures and income statements, anything required to continue their expansionary policies. The same residential mortgage-backed securities that had caused the 2008 GFC over in America had also reappeared in Australia. Non-bank mortgage lenders routinely extended mortgages by combining these mortgages into trusts and selling bonds to investors. These mortgage-backed securities further extended mortgage lending whilst permitting riskier lending behaviour to subprime borrowers. Meanwhile, mortgage stress continued to rise, with many Australian families living paycheck to paycheck. And for nearly a decade, this was the new normal. However, the financial dangers had reappeared behind the scenes, hidden in the shadows. None of the structural conditions which had caused the previous 2008 GFC had been resolved, and as such the same problems had returned, only this time much larger. A primary cause for concern was the substantial rise of over-the-counter derivatives contracts between the banks, products which Warren Buffett called weapons of financial mass destruction. As all of the banks incestuously traded these derivatives between each other, the counterparty risk they all possessed meant that if one bank failed, they all potentially could go under. Eventually, as the notional values of the bank's holdings of derivatives skyrocketed, the banks stopped disclosing publicly the total amounts they held. Deutsche Bank's derivatives exposure in particular has been seen as an extreme risk for a total financial contagion. Meanwhile, in the background of Australia's housing boom, across the globe central banks had embarked upon massive programs of unrestrained asset purchases and liquidity expansion. Interest rates were lowered to record levels, so low that in many European jurisdictions they had embarked upon negative interest rates. The central banks began to directly manipulate the markets. Through institutions such as the Plunge Protection Team and the Exchange Stabilization Fund, central banks and treasury departments continuously pumped newly created currency into markets to keep prices high and the markets liquid. Meanwhile, global asset values appeared completely at the mercy of the actions of the world's central banks. Prices had become completely reliant on continuous injections of artificial liquidity. The large corporations were utilizing these newly created credit lines to finance buybacks of their own stock in order to inflate their values. Global stock markets had rallied to all-time highs. However, as debt levels rose and interest rates were at record lows, there were few tools left within the central bank's arsenal. And so for years our financial system has persisted under this economic insanity. However, it appears that the music has begun to stop, and a financial contagion and global economic reform is only just around the corner. As recently as March 2020, the bubble has finally begun to burst. As the ASX hit a peak on the 21st of February, under a panic supposedly sparked by the coronavirus, within 3 weeks the Australian market had dropped nearly 30%, and the value of the Australian dollar tanked. Markets across the world also dropped significantly, and the world economy froze as coronavirus lockdowns took hold. Whilst the wealth of the upper classes took a sizable hit, the middle classes were decimated. To keep the situation under control, alongside draconian home detention orders, governments around the world announced massive fiscal expansionary policies, funded directly through credit expansions provided by their central banks. In Australia, the Reserve Bank of Australia announced on the 19th of March its first ever round of quantitative easing, with the intention of buying government bonds to provide the Commonwealth government with as much money as it could spend. With a new source of money secured, the government immediately announces a range of fiscal expansionary measures. Stimulus payments through the JobSeeker program and JobKeeper were putting newly created government money directly into the hands of the public. The government also guaranteed a wide range of business loans to increase credit lending. And so today we're in uncharted financial territory. Governments around the world have thrown fiscal conservatism to the wind and have embarked upon unrestrained spending sprees financed by the central banks. Over in the United States, the Federal Reserve continues its trillion-dollar injections of newly created currency directly into the markets, keeping the system afloat with freshly created liquidity. A currency swap agreement of $60 billion was established between the Federal Reserve and the Reserve Bank of Australia to ensure the Australian market had continual access to US dollars. However, as the monopoly of the petrodollar system collapses, with euro and goods-based denominated oil sales occurring, coinciding with the emergence of the Shanghai International Energy Exchange's yuan-based oil futures, it appears America's monopoly over the sale of oil and its status as the global reserve currency hangs in the balance. During this period, as the large corporations have a near unlimited access to newly created credit, it is predictable that these corporations will use this money to purchase every piece of land, machinery, and wealth available until they are the ones who own everything and the people are left destitute in their own countries. In this dystopian future, unless there is reform, the large corporations will have purchased the earth, and the banks will have created the money for them to do so. Under the coordinated psyop of the coronavirus, rather than the average person attributing these unprecedented geopolitical and economic shifts to a debt-based fiat currency system, the mainstream media has continuously repeated the propaganda that it is the coronavirus that has caused our current economic situation. As the mainstream media praises a total shutdown of the global economy and the introduction of fascist lockdowns and authoritarian controls over our lives, the central banks are engaging in endgame maneuvers without the light of public scrutiny. It is whilst the world is being distracted by the pandemic of the coronavirus that behind closed doors the architects of global monetary policy are preparing to establish the new structures of international finance and economics. The ultimate goal for those at the highest echelons of the money power is for the complete centralization of the world's monetary policy into a single institution. They intend to merge the world's central banks together into one organization, a single bank controlling the monetary policy of the entire planet, which the central banks themselves would own and control. In this dystopian future, national currencies would no longer exist, but rather would have been homogenized and replaced by a singular one-world currency issued by the new global bank. In this brave new world, this currency would also be completely digital, with all transactions visible under the watchful eye of the globalist state. This is the long-term agenda for their new world order, and if we can visualize their destination, we can open our eyes to the slow path we are currently taking towards it. It is evident that the recent reforms in Australia's monetary policy have not been the result of democratic grassroots policy making, but rather Australia has been the willing recipient of the financial dictates from the transnational banking authorities. It is the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, that serves as the nexus for this globalist agenda. Unfortunately, many of those within the key positions of Australia's financial regulatory structure have all signalled their allegiance towards the international agenda being set by the BIS. Our Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, has a direct connection with the Bank for International Settlements. Like Nugget Coombs, it too appears that he is a loyal member of the international Freemasonry of central bankers. Alongside regular gatherings with the heads of the world's central banks held at the Bank for International Settlements, today he also serves as the chairman for the BIS's Committee on the Global Financial System. It is interesting to note that Governor Philip Lowe also graduated from the same MIT department, famous for producing many central banking figureheads such as the President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, and the former Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke. The Deputy Governor of the RBA, Guy Debelle, was also a graduate of MIT, and having worked at both the IMF and the BIS, he too is directly connected with the international system. Our APRA chairman, Wayne Byers, the man responsible for regulating the banking sector, also has an extensive history at the BIS, serving as the head of the BIS's Basel's Committee on Banking Supervision, the transnational body attempting to establish a global framework for prudential regulation for banking. The private banks are also well represented within the Australian regulatory system. The chairman of the Australian Securities Investment Commission, James Shipton, the man responsible for regulating investment banking activities, served as the head of regulation in Southeast Asia for Goldman Sachs. Having a Goldman Sachs alumni in charge of regulating Australia's financial products appears strongly as a case of a fox watching the henhouse. Even our old Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, served as a director at Goldman Sachs for multiple years, with the tentacles of the vampire squid stretching deep into the Australian establishment. It is globalists such as these, present within the highest levels of our financial system, that have provided the signals that Australia will be willing to voluntarily adopt the financial dictates from the Bank for International Settlements. In short, our regulatory system has been captured by a cabal who seek to surrender our national sovereignty unto the grand institutions of transnational finance. In anticipation for their new financial architecture, the Bank for International Settlements has been busy passing enabling legislation in countries around the globe. Within the BIS sits a group called the Financial Stability Board. The goal of the Financial Stability Board is to ensure countries around the world are legally and structurally prepared for eventual assimilation into the new globalist financial architecture. It is through the conduits of the FSB that Australia has passed a raft of legislation in anticipation of this future. In February 2018, as Treasurer, Scott Morrison presented and passed the Financial Sector Legislation Amendment, Crisis Resolution Powers and Other Measures Bill. The bill greatly strengthened the resolution powers of Australia's banking regulator APRA in times of a crisis. More importantly, in the event of a market crash or a bank failure, rather than bailing out the banks can now enact bail-in policies, enabling the banks to seize the equity of their creditors, including deposit accounts. The Council of Financial Regulators has also been established as a mechanism to coordinate Australia's monetary policy in a time of economic crisis. Meanwhile, the push to establish a cashless society is also well underway. Across Australia, cash payment systems are slowly being phased out, with the population being conditioned towards digital payments. From card-only automated checkouts in the large supermarkets and retailers, card-only restaurants, many public transport systems across the country also no longer accept cash payments. The coronavirus psyop even attempted to condition people into believing that handling cash was potentially dangerous. The currency, restrictions on the use of cash bill, was the strongest legislative push towards establishing a cashless society in Australia. It introduced 2-year jail sentences and hefty fines for anyone who engaged in a cash transaction over their arbitrary payment amount of $10,000. No doubt there is the intention to decrease this number slowly until eventually all cash payments become illegal. The motive behind establishing a cashless society is that it allows the banks to impose negative interest rates, as well as enable governments to institute excessive taxation regimes upon their people. Beyond full surveillance, moreover, a digitalised currency system represents control. If any individual falls afoul of the central governing authority, the banks would possess the power to freeze their accounts, shut down their banking, and prevent them from transacting in society. In a truly Orwellian world, an authoritarian government would force all individuals to have an RFID chip implanted in their hand, so that if a citizen rebels, the government could simply turn off their chip. Although this may seem like an extreme scenario, digital identification systems such as the COVID Safe app are serving as precursors to establishing such a system, and the possibility of the mark of the beast is very real. It is policies such as these which are central objectives of the globalist agenda. Australia is not facing this danger alone. Whilst other countries possess different histories, collectively we are all facing the same agenda for the future, orchestrated from the singular globalist nexus of the international money power. We are currently at a tipping point. If there is no significant reform, there will come a time in the near future when the think tanks, the universities, and the mainstream media will begin to sing the praises of the New World Order of financial reform. Precipitated by a crisis, engineered or not, governments around the world will be offered the chance to homogenize themselves within the new architectures of global finance. Given the opportunity to exchange their national currencies and absorb their national debts, they will accept the new world international currency alongside relinquishing control over the note issue and any form of monetary authority. Placing all control over monetary policy in the hands of the new global bank, once a country puts on this golden straitjacket, its sovereignty will be lost forever. It is the IMF's special drawing rights currency that is likely to serve as a precursor to a one world currency. With the emergence of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank serving as a direct competitor to the IMF, soon there will be an unholy alliance between the world's leading financial powers, with the sole objective of centralizing the powers over monetary policy into a single overarching system of global control. It is with this centralization of monetary policy that the globalist plans for world domination will be nearly completed. Whilst this might be their intention for the future, any thinking individual would recognise the dangers of such an extreme centralisation of power, and rightfully would actively seek to resist it. And whilst the structures of international finance are engaging in endgame manoeuvres, now more than ever it is imperative that the people begin to organise and prepare themselves both physically and intellectually for the battle that is to come. As such, we must present our own paradigm for the future. We require an alternative to globalist enslavement. We need a method for emancipating ourselves from the tyranny of financial control, the concentrated ownership of monopolistic corporations, and the destitution of scarcity and poverty. One such pathway against the globalist agenda is the ideology of economic nationalism.
Economic nationalism is the political, economic and ideological perspective that governments have an inherent responsibility to not only safeguard the liberties of their citizens, but also the duty to provide favourable economic conditions that improve the living standards of their people. It is the perspective that the mechanisms of government are powerful tools for generating the fundamental economic activity from which the prosperity of the Australian people can derive. The government should actively assist in establishing and supporting essential domestically owned and operated industries against the interests of the globalist corporations and the transnational monopolies.
It is the belief that rather than a dogmatic devotion to the ideology of the laissez-faire free market, protectionism, tariffs and subsidies are effective methods for lifting the Australian economy and developing domestic jobs and industry. Rather than having future generations of its citizens enslaved to service the national debt, the government should be utilising the national credit to uplift the nation and the economic standards of its people. In order to accomplish these objectives, the state needs to be the master over the mechanisms of finance, not the servant. Monetary policy must not remain the sole domain of the international freemasonry of central bankers. Rather, it should be the prerogative of all national governments to reclaim their financial sovereignty and utilise this power for the betterment of their people. Alongside promoting an economic nationalist perspective, this film also advocates several key campaigns. The number one objective should be for the restoration and re-establishment of a government-owned national bank. By restoring control over the note issue back into government hands, the government can become the master of finance rather than the debtor. It is through establishing a government-owned bank that a government is able to break the chains of debt slavery and liberate itself from the financial control of overseas financiers and central banks. Without control over monetary policy, our government is denigrated to the role of a mere vassal state, beholden to the whims of the international banks. It is only by reclaiming this control that our nation can become strong and independent. Over in America, President Trump has effectively nationalized the Federal Reserve, placing it under the authority of the Treasury Department and reclaimed control over the note issue back into government hands. If Trump is able to rein in the Federal Reserve, then Australia is more than capable of reining in the Reserve Bank of Australia. Thus, it should be a priority of any nationally inclined government to restore to the nation the power over finance and re-establish a government-owned national bank. The primary advantage of reclaiming control over the money supply is that the government can then utilise the power of the public credit to provide the finance to embark on a program of grand industrial and infrastructure development to spearhead the economic growth of the country. As Sir Denison Miller himself said, the whole of the resources of Australia are at the back of this bank, and so strong as this continent is, so strong is the Commonwealth Bank. Whatever the Australian people can intelligently conceive in their minds and will loyally support, that can be done. From erecting a high-speed rail network across the country, built using Australian steel and a newly developed Australian-based high-speed rail carriage industry, or multiple water and dam projects capable of irrigating vast segments of inland Australia, Australia is abound with opportunities for industrial development. Even new technologies such as thorium-based nuclear power plants or industrial-scale water desalination facilities can be developed with the finance provided by the National Bank. Indeed, the only limitation on the capacity of Australia's future development is the intellectual capabilities and the entrepreneurial spirit of the Australian people. It is from these grand infrastructure investments that not only will stem large numbers of jobs and secondary economic flows, but also from which the future of Australia's technological innovation will be secured. By shifting away from classical economic metrics such as GDP and focusing upon the physical capacities for production and standards of living, with a national development bank, Australia has an extremely bright economic future. Unfortunately, if we attempted to achieve these policy objectives under our current constitutional form of government, it is most likely that much of the progress would be stifled or outright hindered by the British system of colonial control. Under the surface, Australia is still beholden to the political will of Imperial England. If we look back at our own history, the key moments when the Governor-Generals have utilised their colonial powers was when nationalistically inclined Australian politicians attempted to act in the interests of their own people, opposed to those of their foreign masters. It is in situations like these when the hidden hand of imperial power reveals itself, shining light on the invisible chains of colonialism that still bind Australia. Today, even our elected members of Parliament are forced to swear oaths of loyalty to a foreign monarch. As long as we continue to exist under the rule of British governors and monarchs, Australia will never be a sovereign nation. Thus, it is time that the Republican movement finally got organised and accomplished the task of freeing Australia from its colonial servitude. With a national referendum put forth to the entire Australian population for the adoption of a new constitution creating a new sovereign republic, combined with a Bill of Rights establishing defined limitations on government power and enshrining in law the rights and liberties of the individual in the spirit of the original Magna Carta, that through this method Australia can break the chains of colonialism. Establishing a Republic of Australia should become a national priority. As the previous debt-based fiat currency system collapses, rather than a repeat of the bailouts of the 2008 GFC, the government should shift its priority from bailing out the corporations to bailing out the people. A moratorium on foreclosures and evictions would prevent the private banks from foreclosing on defaulted mortgages, saving hundreds of thousands of families and businesses from homelessness and poverty. Glass-Steagall legislation would place a dividing line between the commercial banks and the savings banks, and is one method of ensuring that the Australian taxpayer is not held responsible for bailing out the private trading banks. In short, the Australian government should focus its attention on bailing out the people, with a perspective that no corporation is too big to fail, and if a corporation does fail, nationalise the assets. Unfortunately, many pieces of legislation that surrender Australia's sovereignty to globalist agendas have already passed through Australian Parliament. Thus, to safeguard our sovereignty, many of these measures need to be reversed. The Financial Sector Legislation Amendment, Crisis Resolution Powers and Other Measures Bill, which granted APRA huge powers at the behest of the Financial Stability Board, enables bail-in policies to seize depositor accounts. These powers should be limited if not reversed completely. The currency restrictions on the use of cash bill must also be removed from Parliament if we are to resist the cashless society and guarantee our right to transact outside of government control. Many of the free trade agreements negotiated by previous governments also heavily favoured transnational corporations over the interests of Australia. Many of the newer agreements included investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which enable foreign corporations to sue the Commonwealth Government in offshore corporate tribunals. These effectively place foreign corporations legally above the reproach of national legislation, and so many of these free trade agreements need to be renegotiated, and these ISDS mechanisms must be revoked. With the world heading towards a global currency reset, one of Australia's main priorities should be the national repatriation of all national gold reserves and those held by the RBA. A nationalistically inclined government acting in the interests of its citizens would prioritise the financial security of its nation and its currency. Currently, the Reserve Bank of Australia has gold reserves totalling over $5.4 billion. Instead of this gold being held within the vaults of the Reserve Bank or the Treasury Building, most of Australia's gold resides in Britain, under the custodianship of the Bank of England. Beyond not having the physical gold within our national boundaries, the RBA also routinely engages in a practice called gold leasing. Rather than possessing physical gold, thanks to these gold leasing arrangements, Australia only possesses claim checks upon this gold. If a global currency crisis was to occur, it is extremely unlikely that this gold would ever be returned. Thus, a key objective for the economic nationalist movement should be the repatriation of Australia's gold reserves back into Australian custody. Ultimately, Australia is a nation of only 25.5 million people. All of these reforms can easily be achieved if the political will is activated. What is required is to awaken the public consciousness with the ideas and the motivation to set these reforms in motion. The Economic Nationalist Society serves as a grassroots institution to develop this consciousness in the public domain. If you have been inspired by this film and wish to join and support these campaigns, I invite you to join the Economic Nationalist Society. If there isn't a group in your area, I implore you to start a local chapter, or even establish your own organisations. It is only through a large-scale awakening of the public consciousness and the emergence of grassroots clubs and societies actively pushing for these reforms that the critical mass of awareness can be activated to successfully achieve these objectives.
In conclusion, the mechanisms of finance should not remain the exclusive privilege of an unelected cabal of private bankers. Rather, the government should reclaim this power and restore it to the people to whom it rightfully belongs. No longer should Australia's monetary policy be held by organisations whose loyalty is not to the Australian people, and under no circumstances should we surrender this control over finance to the transnational institutions who seek to establish a one-world currency. This is a rallying call that now is the time that we must organise and fight for a world where finance is the servant, not the master of our society. It is time that the people finally won the battle against the banks.